I'd like to call to order the study session for tonight, March 21st, 2023. Will you please stand and join me for the Pledge of Allegiance?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Clerk, will you call the roll, please?
Mayor Parsbeck.
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Grace.
Here.
Trustee Hardy.
Here.
Trustee Sorcelli.
Here.
Trustee Ayers.
Here.
Trustee Murphy.
Here.
Trustee Butler.
Here. Okay, we have a full board tonight. We also requested that anyone from the planning and zoning, if they'd like to attend, to come tonight. So thank you. Oh, we got 4 now tonight that showed up. Melissa, feel free to grab some food and drinks and all that. So since this is a study session, we won't have no reports, anything else other tonight than a water policy discussion. And we have our water attorney here, Pete Johnson, to give us a presentation. Welcome.
Thank you.
Let's turn it over to you.
Okay, great. Thanks for having me, and happy to give the presentation to you all today. So my rough plan for the presentation is I'm going to present the basics of what we're really talking about when we talk about studying the water dedication policy for the town. I'll present a little bit of a sort of regional overlook of what similar communities in the Northern Front Range here are doing with respect to water dedication policy. And then we'll talk about the specific aspects of the town's water dedication policy and make some comparisons to how that applies to the sort of regional overlook. And then we'll talk a little bit about different potential facets of the water dedication policy that can be adjusted or changed based on the specific situation the town is in with respect to its water supply and development of that water supply. So I'll start with the basics and kind of move more into the specifics and move more to the specifics relative to the town itself as we go along. So before I even get to the first substantive slide here, it probably would be helpful for some of you to talk about what do we even mean when we talk about water dedication policy. And so really what we're talking about tonight is the policy that the town implements with respect to any new type of development within the town. And new development can mean a couple of different things. It can mean new areas that might be annexed into the town, or it could just mean development within the town. So a change in land use, residential or commercial type development happening within town. Any of those types of changes are going to require water and require additional water from the town to support the water service that will be provided to that new development. And so the water dedication policy really prescribes how the town provides that water and the details of how you go through that process as a person seeking approval of a new development within town. So finally get to the first slide here. Can you all see this? Okay, you're seeing it on your screens, good. So basically for any water dedication policy just in general, there are really 2 basic options, and you see them underlined there under the 1 and 2. It's basically dedicate or pay, right? So the first option is to dedicate water rights to the town, and I'm just speaking generally here, so when I say town, I mean any old town, not just Berthoud. And dedication of water rights actually brings usable water rights to the town, and that is dedicated to the town to serve a proposed new development. The town would analyze those water rights on a case-by-case basis as a dedication was proposed to identify and analyze whether that particular water right or set of water rights is actually usable by the town and what would be required for the town to put that to use for municipal purposes, to provide water service to the new development. Normally that requires water court action. You all probably know here in Colorado we have one of the most sort of court-involved systems for any sort of change in use of water. So for your typical water dedication, you're usually talking about a conversion from some existing type of use to a municipal type of use. And normally that will require water court action, which obviously takes some time and involves some legal and engineering expenses as well. We'll talk about a few exceptions to that rule, but that's the general rule. So then the second option is to pay, and the second option is to pay what is known as a cash in lieu fee to the town. And Cash in lieu is a sort of wonky term, but the way to think about that is it's cash in lieu of water. So instead of bringing water to the town, you're paying the town for water rights that the town may already have or that the town could develop on its own. So any payment of a cash in lieu fee provides funds to the town for acquisition of new water rights, water supply projects. Those could be, current water supply projects or future planned water supply projects. And then also for the related water supply facilities and infrastructure that are necessary to continue to provide water to new developments. And then lastly here I have that there is a sort of hybrid approach that is possible too. So it's not necessarily all or nothing, you pay or you dedicate. Towns sometimes require a hybrid approach, require a certain amount of dedication or a certain amount of cash in lieu payment. And so there are different ways that can be approached as well with respect to this policy. So for any water dedication policy, there's a few basic elements that are really kind of the drivers behind the policy itself. First is what I just mentioned, so the option of providing a cash in lieu payment or a water dedication, the fact of providing the option of allowing new development to pay its way into water service is something to be considered with respect to the policy. The second and probably most obvious one is the price. If you are going to offer cash in lieu, the price that you set per unit of water demand is very critical to that policy. And then the third is the timing of cash in lieu payments or water dedication. And what we mean with respect to timing is at what point in the development approval process does the water actually have to be transferred to the town, or do those cash in lieu payments actually have to be made to the town? And we'll talk in a little more detail about that in a moment. And then number 4 I have here is the amount of water dedication or cash in lieu payment. With respect to this one, I'll go into a little detail in a further slide, but the amount of water dedication from town to town or municipality to municipality is really more of an engineering determination of the water use within a town, the consumption of that water use, and then things like the specifics of the town infrastructure like system losses, treatment losses, things like that. So it's not so much a policy decision, the amount, it's pretty well set by engineering analyses that say, a standard unit of water demand in your town is going to consume about this much water. And that can vary just based on different factors such as the age of a town's water system, the types of water that's being provided into that system and the associated losses, things like that. So I'm not going to talk that much about amount tonight because it's really a little bit separate from the realm of a policy discussion. So getting into the kind of regional overlook here with respect to those 4 elements I just laid out, with respect to the option of cash in lieu versus water dedication, or maybe I should say option of cash in lieu or water dedication, it's typical here in the Northern Front Range that towns will offer a cash in lieu payment, that is a possibility under their town code, but it's typically at the town's discretion. So that gives the town the ability to analyze each proposal as they're coming in and ensure that it is, able to accept that money in exchange for water service and then provide the underlying water service to the proposed development in the amount that is proposed, for the water demand associated with that development. And then typically you'll find that towns require dedication of historical water rights. What that means is if a property is to be annexed or a new development is proposed for a property, say that's an agricultural property that has been irrigated agriculture, in its history, typically towns will require that any water rights that have been historically used on that property would be dedicated as part of the development approval annexation or as part of the transaction in which the town agrees to provide water service. The general thing to understand here is that if there's the possibility of a town getting water out of real water rights out of the deal, and those water rights are actually usable by the town, then it's usually preferable to get those water rights versus taking money in exchange for that water service. So that's a a pretty consistent theme you'll see throughout the codes and the way that various municipalities around the Northern Front Range here have been addressing their water dedication policy. The second one here I have is the price of cash in lieu payments. And as you can imagine, this is a pretty big spectrum of prices from community to community in the Front Range. And that's really a range that's based on just the factors that are specific to that town's water supply portfolio, and then of course the unit cost associated with providing water to its citizens. So on the high side, you'll see entities that tend to calibrate their cash in lieu payments to the CBT market because they know that CBT is a water right type, or a type of water that they can readily integrate into their system. But as most of you probably know, CBT is also one of the most expensive water rights in the Northern Front Range right now. So if you're going to calibrate your cash in lieu value to the CBT market, you're going to be on the high side of things, and you'll see those same kind of market effects. So that price right now is in the range of about $113,000 per acre foot, which again is some of the highest prices you'll see anywhere in the state really right now, but certainly in this geographic area. Then on the lower side of price are towns like Loveland and Longmont come to mind in our immediate area. These are towns that have been developing for a long time, so they've been developing their water systems and their water supply portfolios for a long time. So they tend to have either they've gotten into existing water supply development projects at a lower price because they got into them decades ago, or they've just been able to acquire more senior, more reliable water rights at a lower unit price, again just because they've been in that game for longer and they have a bit of a head start on younger communities that are growing more in recent decades.
Pete?
Yeah.
And Mayor Karsbeck, just for the planning commissioners, and because I know we've done water one-on-one with the board, for some of you several times, some of you only once, but if there's terms that we use like acre foot, and you don't know what that is, and just, I think it's okay to stop and ask that question. Is that fair to say? Is that, yeah.
Absolutely.
I just don't want anybody to sit and listen and go, this sounds like Mandarin Chinese to me, and I don't know why I'm here.
Good point.
So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm glad you brought that up, but this is just an example, but things like the 113, is that per lot? I mean, do you get into the details of like everything you're putting now up, or should we ask questions on things like that?
Please go ahead. This is fairly high level, so I'll gloss over several details as we go along.
Okay.
The way to think about an acre foot is under the town code, 1 SFE, which is a single family equivalent. That's the way we kind of standardize water demand, is by that SFE value. So 1 SFE under the town code, which is basically a single family residence with a lot size under 6,000 square feet, is 0.4 acre feet per year of demand, water demand.
So a developer would have to pay that on all the units that they're developing?
For each
And or an
unit.
individual owner?
Yes.
The builder, right?
It can be either or. In many cases, developers will come in and pre-buy water. So they may come in and buy 100 SFEs, and then they will then sell those to the builders when they sell the lot, so that that lot has water when they come in to buy the permit. For smaller builders, and especially in like a semi-custom or custom scenario, that's not always the case. And so they may come in and just buy at the building permit.
Gotcha. Okay. Thank you.
And then could you give some examples of what water dedication would look like? You mentioned one. If it were an agricultural piece of property, it may already have irrigation. What are other examples of water dedication?
Sure. If you wait just like
Okay.
one more slide, I'll
Sure.
get right to that in just a second here. Okay, great.
And an acre foot is what it takes to cover an acre of land in a foot deep of water, right? I mean, that's,
So approximately a football field is kind of the classic
Right.
example.
And just simple math is at 0.4 acre feet per SFE, 1 acre foot gets you about 2.5 SFEs.
I did have just a clarifying question about the cash in lieu payments and what it covers. Because it mentioned facilities and infrastructure. Is that just raw water infrastructure and not treatment plants and everything kind of downstream of the
That's generally correct. The code gives you some discretion there, so, you know, it's really, it's money that the town is supposed to be putting towards, right, supplying the water demand associated with the developer making the payment.
Yeah,
So that may require, you know, upgrades to various types of infrastructure. But generally, the cash in lieu fee is really calibrated to the value of the raw water
To the raw
part of the
water.
system that's being committed as a result of that payment.
And as an example, you know, we have a main raw water line that comes from Carter Lake directly to our water treatment plant. Improvements to that line, expansion of that line, those types of things, that would be an appropriate water expense for our cash in lieu
Gotcha.
fund. We have a separate account of money that gets paid by new development also. We collect mitigation fees for water, wastewater, roads, parks, public facilities. All of those you could look at as a cash in lieu fee, right? Rather than build me a new road, you pay me a fee for every house you build, and we'll go expand roads as we need to. It's kind of the same scenario.
But it's separate and kind of outside of this range.
Those are separate, and we collect a water mitigation fee or impact fee that then we typically use for treatment plants and downstream infrastructure from the treatment plant. So kind of generally speaking, in almost every case, upstream of the treatment plant would be something we might spend cash in lieu on, and then downstream of the treatment plant would be water mitigation, water impact.
That's
Yeah.
helpful. Thanks.
Are you gonna talk about capacity of the town? Is that part of the presentation?
Yes, fairly briefly, that was really kind of the focus of the last presentation, but, you know, happy to follow up with you with details if it's helpful.
Thank you.
Sure. And to your point about the infrastructure piece, I think Chris laid out, those are really helpful sort of broad guidelines, but it does get a little murky, right? For example, the town recently did some improvements to its water treatment plant. As a result of those improvements, the town can now much more effectively use Berthoud Reservoir as a water source. So even though they're infrastructure investments in the water treatment piece, they really have an effect on firming up
Raw water
the reservoir as a
optimization,
piece of
yeah.
raw water for the town too. So it's not always a perfect dividing line.
Yeah, yeah. The Venn diagram crosses slightly, but
Yeah,
I just kind of
exactly.
wanted to make sure I had my.
And we do typically blend funding sources in those kinds of cases.
Gotcha. Cool. Thanks for that.
So, getting back to the sort of regional outlook here, with respect to the timing of cash in lieu payments or water dedication, you'll find a lot of nuanced differences from one community to another, but there are a few common themes you can see, which is typically anytime there are historical water rights involved, again, water rights that have been historically used on a property, that have not been, you know, sold off prior to the development proposal. Most towns will require that those be dedicated as part of the either annexation or approval of the new development. And then with respect to the, well, this one's pretty obvious, but most towns obviously require dedication or payment prior to the town actually providing water service, right? So that's kind of the broad concept here. And then within that, though, are specifics, and there's quite a range of when in the development approval process a town might require the payment or dedication to be made. A lot of towns have a requirement that happens upon final plat approval. Others, like Berthoud, have a requirement that happens before any building permits can be issued for the development at issue. So there's a range of how communities are dealing with the timing issue. And then with respect to the amount, this is kind of a reiteration of what I said earlier, but this is really based on the specific nature of a town's water supply system. And so given those differences up and down the Front Range here, you'll see different SFE values are used for the unit demands for different communities. But again, that's really based on the unit demand itself, whether that town has a non-potable irrigation system and the extent to which, you know, that compares to their overall irrigation use, potable irrigation use within the town. And then, as I said, just in-system losses within their treatment, conveyance treatment and distribution system. That's obviously gonna vary from town to town based on the age of the system, the specific components of the system, and those kinds of things. So that is probably the last time you'll hear me talk about the amount of water dedication. Suffice it to say, you have a lot of very smart engineering consultants and semi-smart water attorneys that are focused on the amount issue and making sure that remains, well calibrated to the actual unit demand that you're seeing for water use here within the town.
So Attorney Johnson, on that point, and I won't push it because I totally trust you guys, but you brought up the last meeting that it does include like transmission losses, like evaporative losses, all that. So we
Yes.
weren't just we're measuring 0.4 at the house. We're actually
Right.
measuring it higher up. Okay.
That's right, yep. Okay, so getting into the specifics of the town's water dedication ordinance and policy itself. I threw a lot of words on this slide, but the basic point of this slide is that the town does right now offer the option of cash in lieu. So any new development in town is required to either dedicate what are known as acceptable water rights, which I'll get into what acceptable means here in just a second, or they have to pay the appropriate cash in lieu fee to the town.
You might be getting to this, but could I ask kind of the proportion of what we've seen, say, I don't know if you know, but in the past 5 years of what percent does cash in lieu and what percent does dedicate?
Sure. In the past 5 years, and Chris, you may know better than me, but I would say in the past 5 years, it's been mostly cash in lieu.
I would say,
Almost entirely.
95%.
Mhm.
We have accepted some dedication, and so what happens in that scenario is we work the developer, they dedicate a certain amount of water rights depending on the source and how much we believe we'll get as a firm yield out of that, then we give them credit based on the number of SFEs worth of water they gave us, and then they can draw down against those as they build. The vast majority for the last 5 years have been cash in lieu. And I think prior to that, frankly, yeah.
I mean, it makes sense. It's easier.
It's a much simpler system for them.
Yeah.
There's benefit to us because we control then what water we ultimately get rather than just getting what's dedicated to us.
Yep.
And it gives us some money to build infrastructure and other things, but it comes with risk. And that's some of what we'll talk about tonight.
Awesome.
I think Chris could do this presentation for me if we let him, but, so getting back to your question about what does the dedication of water rights look like? So what happens is, any dedication of water rights requires a written agreement with the town, so there's obviously a negotiation process with respect to that agreement. And then the town code requires, or allows only the dedication of what are called acceptable water rights, and the code itself has some criteria for what acceptable is. The basic criteria is they're either deliverable to Berthoud Reservoir or deliverable to the town's water treatment plant. Most of you probably know those are right next to each other, so that's maybe effectively one criteria. But then it also requires a legal and engineering analysis, so your engineering consultants and our office would take a hard look at any water rights proposed for dedication, look at the priority of those water rights, their seniority to withdraw water off of a river system, any other legal constraints on the ability to use, such as what are the lawfully authorized types of use, is a water court action required to make these water rights usable by the town. And then the engineering analysis will analyze things like what is the effective firm yield of those water rights over time? Are there any operational nuances or difficulties that the town should consider? And so all of those things will be considered by the town and whether to accept a specific dedication of water rights or not. With respect to specific types of water rights, and for Berthoud there are two, CBT and handy ditch shares. The town code does have a standardized unit value for those water rights because we already know generally what one CBT unit or what one handy ditch share will yield to the town. We already know that those are water rights that are usable by the town. So if someone is proposing a dedication of those specific types of water rights, it's a little more of a mechanical process than having to do a very specific legal and engineering analysis to examine those types of issues. So for CBT, 1 unit of CBT is under the town code, that equals 0.6 acre feet of yield per year. In reality, the CBT system has actually averaged about 0.7 acre feet per year historically. So this is a good conservative value for the town to use. There is the potential that you can get lower than 0.6 in certain circumstances as well. So, but that said, like I said, the historical average is above that, so it's generally a good conservative value to use. Again, that's 1.5 SFEs per CBT unit. And that is, these numbers are how you get to the acre foot value that I showed earlier that show you that, well, one CBT unit gets you 1.5 SFEs, but generally costs, upwards of $60,000-$70,000 at this point. So it's a very expensive water source right now. And then with handy ditch shares, the town code prescribes that the town would give 4.4 acre feet of credit, which is 11 SFEs per share in the handy ditch. So those are the only types of specific water rights that the town code addresses and sets forth these specific values for dedications of those water rights. And then for any dedication of water rights, as I mentioned earlier, almost every time it's going to require a water court action to be able to change those water rights for the town's municipal use. So there's a number of different aspects of the legal use of that water you have to change to make it available for the town. And so the town imposes a fee of $1,250 per acre foot for any water rights dedication to try to cover those legal expenses that are associated with the water court action.
So the water rights fee is only for dedication, not for cash in lieu?
That's right.
And the water court is a berthed entity?
No, that's a state, it's a district court, state
Okay,
district court,
okay.
yeah. So the one we typically deal with for Berthoud is the water court in Greeley, actually, which is the whole South Platte River Basin, the water court for that entire basin.
And Pete,
Yep.
before you hit this one, when we purchase water with cash and lieu funds that we've collected, we do that same kind of legal and engineering analyses on water rights that may be available to us as well. So, our priority focus is water rights that are native to our watershed. But there are lots of water sources out there, and we've looked at a handful, and we're looking at one right now that's unique. And so that legal and engineering analysis goes into water that we purchase also that may not be CBT water. Anyway, sorry, I just thought I'd point that out.
Right. Good. So that was kind of my slide about water dedications, and now I'll talk a little bit about cash in lieu and how the cash in lieu part of the system works. So the first thing to understand about cash in lieu is any acceptance of cash in lieu is at the town's discretion. So just because a developer comes with a big check doesn't mean the town has to accept that and be obligated to provide water service to that development. It kind of gets back to similar to what Chris was just saying, that anytime that type of proposal is put before staff is taking a hard look at a bunch of different factors with respect to can we, again, is the key question here is, can the town use those cash in lieu funds to either develop existing water parts of its water system to generate water for the new development, or can it go out on the open market and acquire water rights that can be usable by the town to satisfy the demands of that new development that's proposed. So this, at the bottom of the slide, here's some list of the factors we would examine with respect to any cash in lieu payment proposal. The town would look at the overall balance of water supply and demand. The basic premise here is, does the town have water in its portfolio that it has not yet committed that it can provide for new development? The town would look at the amount of cash in lieu funds collected to date, just to see, where the town is in generating its cash in lieu funds versus the sort of cost of pending and ongoing water projects for the town, to get a feel for, does the town need additional funds to be able to complete certain water supply development projects to be able to provide additional water in the future. And then with respect to those water supply development projects, the town will look at the cost of those projects, obviously, but also the timing of those projects, and then the ultimate yield of those projects in terms of how much water are those projects actually gonna bring, and how much, new growth and development can that potentially support. And then lastly, in the case of potentially going out on the open market and acquiring water rights, the town will look at the cost and availability of water rights on the general market. So, again, in Berthoud's case, you're looking at the CBT market as kind of the high side of the unit priced market. But there are certain benefits in that it's, easily integrated into the town's water system. And then there's, other water rights that the town understands more closely, such as the handy ditch shares that I just mentioned. The town understands better the specific value of going out and acquiring a share of handy and what that can provide in terms of, units of demand that can support for any type of development.
So if a developer came into town, didn't have anything to dedicate because their land didn't have any water rights on it.
Mhm.
And they said, hey, we'll just write you a big fat check for cash in lieu, and the town goes, we don't really have anything in our portfolio that we're willing to give up for that. They would then have to then go buy their own through, source it themselves, instead of having the town source it for them, because essentially, we've already pre-sourced with our water portfolio. But if we don't want to give up anything in our water portfolio, they could go there and go buy it, which may not be as good for them because they might not be able to have the buying power, say, as we do, maybe. Is there something like that with like supply and demand and buying? I'm thinking small business thoughts here. But,
Sure.
I can't buy at the same rate as maybe a bigger company could. So how does all that work there?
Yeah.
I mean, they would just have to go to water court themselves, buy it, pay their own attorney fees, come back and say, hey, we're able to find enough acre footage for our development.
It's-
And now we're gonna dedicate it to you. And now they gotta pay another $1,250 per acre foot to get it dedicated to us.
It's potentially worse and harder in some respects in that they couldn't even go into water court themselves because they can't, as a private entity, get the water authorized for the town's use, right? So the town would have to be part of that action, or the water rights would have to be dedicated to the town and then, proceed through water court. But you're right, in that situation, if the town says, no, we're not gonna accept cash in lieu, then really the functional alternative is to go find water rights that you could purchase on the open market to dedicate to the town. And that's really the only option. So, your point is well taken, that I think is one of the core values of the cash in lieu system, is that it keeps all of that purchasing power and planning power within the town itself, right? And gives the town the control. So rather than forcing private individuals to try to go out in the market and find water rights, and then, worst case scenario, someone could bring that back to the town, and then the town could say, we don't think this is usable, right? So we're not gonna accept dedication. So it puts a lot of a burden on those folks to go out and find water and to know that it's water that's gonna be able to, ultimately support their development, as opposed to putting some of that onus on the town to do its own development and supply development and give the town that ability to do that, and then, just allow developers to pay into that system essentially.
I haven't been on the planning commission very long, but numerous projects have come up. I don't recall one time there being any discussion about water, so is it a foregone conclusion? By the time it reaches us, it's already been approved?
So when developments are currently approved, they are not dedicating water prior to plating. The way that we currently accept cash in lieu payments is that building permit, or we allow developers to buy typically per phase or per filing of platted lots. So like, we have had developers who've come in and said, hey, I've got $7 million and I wanna buy 2,000 SFEs worth of water for my project. And we said, no, you don't have 2,000 lots platted, those have not been approved. Even if you have an approved PUD that grants you, via zoning, the ability to develop 2,000 lots, we've said no a handful of times. And so typically they come in and buy SFEs in kind of the 100 SFE chunk range, and that gives us the ability to kind of meter those out in a way where we still have a large buffer of what we currently own and what we have access to from a supply standpoint, and be able to kind of sell what we already own as we're out acquiring and developing more. there's that kind of cushion, right? And there's risk associated with that. I think that's just the reality of the cash and lose system, in that at some point you get to a place, in theory, we obviously wouldn't want this to happen, and we're working very diligently that it won't, but it is possible,
But we
even if it's not
approve
probable,
something.
that we might have builders come in and say, I wanna buy SFE's worth of water, and the town says, we don't have enough left to sell you, tough luck.
Is that out of scope for us when we approve something? Is that not something?
In our current, the way our code is currently written, yes, I
Okay.
would say that that's true. And I
Okay.
think that's part of the discussion that we're having tonight. Is that what the board wants us to continue to do? Obviously, we think that the cash and lose system has been working, or we wouldn't have continued to utilize it. We would have come a long time ago and said, we need to eliminate this now, it's a major problem. But it does carry some risk.
And
So
what-
does every other policy.
I have a bunch of questions on that risk. Do you want me to ask them now, or?
It's up to you. I mean, I think we can dive in now, or if you want, Pete can finish up, and then we can kind of jump into that kind of broader policy discussion.
I don't wanna, I mean, you might be answering this, or I don't wanna get in the way of your presentation if.
Sure, and
You
I
guys
think
keep going.
the next slide in particular might help provide some context for your
Thank you.
issues too, so. So looking at these kind of general factors that we look at with any specific cash and lieu proposal, here's how it sort of shakes out relative to the town's current situation, current status. So with respect to the current water supply and demand balance, as of last year, the town did an analysis, its engineering consultants did an analysis that indicated that the town has an existing surplus of approximately 1,500 SFEs beyond its current commitments. This is now a year old, but Chris, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think we've made any significant cash and lieu transactions since that projection was done. There've been some that moved some of those credits around, but no big purchases.
In fact, that's the vast majority of what we're getting now is, we pre-sold those commitments or what we've already pre-sold, basically. People that have already come in and bought cash in lieu and they have credits in our bank, if you wanna look at it that way. And really all of the building that's going on now, with the exception of like one-off projects, if somebody has and in fact, I can think of one place, they had like a 3-acre lot, they built a custom home on, they come in and pay. Commercial development is paying cash in lieu, they haven't pre-bought water because it's a one-lot development scenario. But all the residential development that's occurring right now, the vast majority of it, if not all, I actually don't know off the top of my head, but I think probably all of it is water that's already been sold and that's already kind of accounted for in our bank, so. And there's quite a bit left in terms of the current amount of credits in our bank.
That's the 1,500?
That's the commitments. So
Okay,
we've got another
1,500.
1,500 SFEs beyond what we've already committed.
Yes, that's, okay.
Yeah.
So in that, I mean, we have some 3 big developments.
We do.
We have 1,500 left available for those 3 big.
No, because they've already pre-bought a fairly significant amount of water. Several of those developments have.
They have already.
Like the Farmstead's bought hundreds of SFEs.
Ludlow,
uh,
Bertha 160 of that, have
Heron
they?
Lakes has bought hundreds of SFEs. Ludlow, we don't allow them to buy SFEs because they don't have platted lots.
Right, okay, so we're not with these, so these guys.
And so like when Ludlow asked me, they said, hey, we're counting on cash and lieu, and I said, well, you shouldn't.
Mhm.
I mean, it may be available or it may not,
Right.
so, and our policy says it's our discretion, so, if you're planning to wet that entire project with cash and lieu, that may or may not be available to you. If we continue to develop our water sources the way that we are planning, that we're working on right now, that will probably work out just fine. If it doesn't, if we're not able to firm up our Windy Gap and some of these other current water supply projects Pete has on this slide, he'll talk about in a sec, then.
So that's what I'm
we're
getting
not-
to, so this 1,500 would be potentially for Ludlow too? 'Cause they
It'd be
have
for,
dedicated.
it's for anybody that comes in and buys water under our current policy.
So Ludlow would be how many SFPs just in itself?
13 to 1,800 probably, depending on what ultimately gets platted.
So after just one development, we'll probably have 200, 300 left? One community.
No, because our goal is to have a whole lot more developed long before they get to that point, right? To develop 13 to 1,500 lots is probably a 10 to 15 year build out minimum. And so we've got, it doesn't all hit at once, right? And we don't allow them to buy it all at once. We wouldn't allow them to come in and say, I'm taking 1,500 SFEs, here's your, whatever that is, probably, $50 million check.
Yeah,
We wouldn't allow them to do that.
how many do you allow then?
We allow platted lots, and that's typically, the way it generally works, and this has been true in most projects in town. They'll come in and you know, they'll have a whole development approved, and then they'll come in and plat out by like a phase, right? They won't plat the entire, like Farmstead's not platting out the entire thing. Their first phase was a couple hundred lots. And so they could come in and buy those 200, but not the 2,000 that might be approved within the context of zoning, right? And so they're buying them in much smaller chunks than like the 1,500 or 1,800 at a time. Does that make sense?
You don't have any worry about even 100 units, the cost escalating in that time frame?
Well,
by
I
the
mean,
end of that
costs
time-
have skyrocketed.
Right, that's my
There's no
point.
doubt about that.
Concerning.
And so there's this interesting balance when we talk about price. And I don't want, you know, I'm happy to talk as long as you want. Pete will correct me because I'll probably say some stuff that's wrong. But I look at it like this. We bought water at a certain price. That what we've committed and what we have in our bank is water we already own, right? And we bought that at a certain price, much cheaper than what water is selling for today. But we have to then go buy the next supply, right? So this kind of interesting balance between like we're selling water we bought at a lesser price than what we could buy it for today, and we're selling it for more than we paid for it, but we also have to go buy water for more than what we may be collecting today, right? So there's this really interesting balance, and it depends on which sources we're buying. There are sources that we can buy today within the price of our current cash and lieu price. CBT water excluded, right?
Yeah, I think that's the
Yeah,
crux
I mean,
Yeah,
Just
CBT
really
water
staying
is
on top of it.
more
This is
expensive.
the next slide
Yeah,
here,
there you
so.
go.
Can I ask one question on
This is all good stuff, man.
Sure.
It's like right
I
in
just did
line.
that.
I like it.
Could you convert that 1,500 to single-family lots? What would that be the equivalent of?
It is
It's
1,500.
1,500. That's what it
is?
means.
Oh,
Yeah.
SFE is a single family.
Single family equivalent.
SFE, and I think I misspoke about the square footage, but it's up to 12,000 square foot lot. So it's your typical
okay.
size residential lot in town.
Actually, today 12,000 is a very large residential lot.
Yeah, right, right.
That used to be typical.
And then you get a credit for what, under 3,500 square feet, I think.
Yeah.
it is.
Yeah, I think it's 3,500.
Jerry Johnson, last time you were here, wasn't that 1,000? Where you guys have always been shooting for 1,500, or that's always been the estimate?
No, that's the analysis that was done, I think, March of last year.
Okay.
And a big part of that analysis, which was the most difficult part, was homing in on what Chris was getting at, which is accurately characterizing the commitments that have been made, but understanding that, you know, some of those commitments have not yet been realized for these developers that have paid in advance and for which the town has issued water credits. We have to make sure we're counting that as part of the committed water supply so that we're not, you know, missing that part of the puzzle, right? So that was the conclusion of that study last March, and as I said, that's still a pretty good number today because we haven't made substantial additional commitments since that time last year. So
Sorry, I hate
Yeah,
to
go ahead.
ask another question,
No,
but
go
just because I like to keep things organized. If I were to total up this slide, so we have 1,500 SFEs, say, available right now beyond commitments. If you go to the third bullet, it looks like we have 2,500 that, I guess I'll loosely use the term, are in the works, right? Because we have ongoing projects that we're developing,
Right.
planning for growth, et cetera. And then above and beyond that, we have a cash fund of 30 million that could go and put additional projects in the works column, right?
right, but be careful with the above and beyond, right? Because
Yeah.
a significant amount of the cash and lieu funds will be used to fund
Oh,
the
okay.
water
That-
supply
and that's what I was
projects.
Kind of getting at, so if you add those two up, that's about 4,000 SFEs that we have either water in the bank, so to speak, or that we're planning for, and then maybe a little bit extra cash left over to get additional SFEs, but let's just say 4,000, 5,000 SFEs is kind of in our portfolio and being planned for, our future portfolio and existing portfolio.
That's right.
And I think it's important to remember too that 4,000 SFEs, by the time those are sold, assuming we never changed price, which we ultimately will, right? I mean, it's gotten prohibitively expensive for some water sources. That's another $100 million, right? 4,000 SFEs sold at 25,000 an SFE is another $100 million in the bank, right? So it's not that we will sell 4,000 SFEs and then be screwed.
Yeah,
We'll have another $100 million
to go get
to develop the next round,
Yeah.
right, at our current price. So I think it's important to remember, it's not like there's not an end, right? right? This is one of those. Well, never mind. I'm not gonna wax poetic.
But we wanna be keeping up, yeah, and
Yeah.
that's the thing, nobody has the crystal ball.
That's
Nobody
right,
has
and
the crystal
is,
ball.
that's the real question, right?
Yeah, no.
How do we know that $100 million is gonna be enough by the time we sell those 4,000 FSFEs, which is probably 25 years from now, right?
Right.
You know,
And that's-
4,000 SFEs is a 25-year or 30-year build out. Now, it could go much faster than that, right? I mean, historically, we wouldn't be anywhere close to that, but if you only look at the last 3 years, shoot, that could be 10 years instead of 25. That pace of building has already dropped and it's very unlikely to continue, but it could, and then maybe that's a great thing, because then maybe $100 million worth a whole lot more 10 years from now than it will be 25 or 30 years from now, right? So and it might be a whole lot more than 100 million if we increase cash in lieu over the next 10 years, which we ultimately, I'm sure, will more than once, assuming we maintain a cash in lieu policy.
Yeah, sorry, I have a question. It might be outside the scope of this conversation as well, but as we continue to buy and sell water and approve projects, et cetera, how does and if it does, how does that affect the cost to the current residents as far as?
It doesn't impact current residents at all.
Okay.
Or shouldn't. The idea of buying and developing new sources of water, and the reason for cash in lieu is that the idea and the intent is that development is paying for that water, not existing residents.
So the cost of my water coming out of my tap is based on a completely different system than what is being purchased and sold in the actual acquisition process?
Yes, it is. The price that comes out of your tap is based on a whole variety of things, but the vast majority of that is how much does it cost to treat it and deliver it to you as a customer. Not to go out and buy water, because you as a customer, we already have water for you, right? And so while there might be some overlap, like the treatment project that we just discussed is a good example. That benefits current customers because the primary improvement that we made is implementing Ken could talk about this a lot more intelligent than I could, so slap me if I'm wrong. But was
developed a blending facility so we could be able to blend several water sources, thereby better utilizing our existing water portfolio. And then chemical treatment so that some of these sources that are coming in aren't coming out of pristine Carter Lake. And so we needed to ratchet that up a notch.
Yeah, and some of it's coming out of Berthoud Reservoir that can be kind of skunky because of algae growth. And so improving that water quality benefits current customers, so there's an overlap there. We pay for part of that with current customer fees, right? Does that answer your question?
It does, yeah, thank you.
Actually, and then, if I remember, I think this came up in one of our press meetings, but we can't like overbuy. Are we limited by how much water we can buy based on our size of our town? We can't go in and just like start banking water.
There's a few constraints.
Let's talk afterwards.
It's very nuanced, but like for CBT, there's what they call the CBT cap. So there's a cap on how much any specific town or municipality, how many units in that project it can own, and that's a factor of your other water rights and your overall demand, and it's a kind of a complicated formula. Then there's also what's called the sort of anti-speculation law in Colorado, which means you can't go out and acquire new water without a specific plan and intent to put that to use and, use that water for beneficial uses that are, legally recognized. So there are some constraints, but in terms of anything that we would actually propose the town acquire, it's basically the market is the ultimate constraint, so price and
Yeah,
availability.
so I could
of
just
funds.
picture a town going out and buying a whole bunch of water, and then the neighboring cities are like, oh, Berthoud bought up all the water. And it's like, oh, hey, we're sitting over here. You wanna buy some water?
Yeah, sell it to you for
Lot of money.
20% more.
I don't think a town our size could ever get accused of that, but there are metropolitan areas on the Front Range that do get that accusation sometimes.
Sure.
And they get, I wouldn't say they get away with it, but they're allotted that privilege because of their size and their growth projections.
And you all might remember from our last, my last presentation that in Colorado, we have the priority system. So it's, that means the more senior water rights are more valuable and can shut off the water rights that come later in time. So there's just an inherent advantage for towns and communities that have been developing their systems, further in time, right? Or starting from earlier in time. they just were able to take advantage of the seniority of water rights and the just lower unit price, you know,
But
30,
we've got a
40,
pretty
50, 100 years ago.
handle on that, right? I mean, we've talked about the stories about the guys with the rifles protecting the water out of
Right.
Thompson,
Right.
or senior water rights from
And
1800 and whatever, but.
Berthoud is a good example. I mean, Berthoud is owns a significant portion of the #1 priority on the Big Thompson River, which is incredibly useful and beneficial water right, and it's very secure and stable. But it's not enough for, for growth, for time to come, right? So
Being a small town, we've got pretty good pull.
I did have a question for you, Administrator Kirk. It might be a little bit in the weeds, but hypothetical. Say Metro District starts, they get their first round platted, it's fine. Are they then allowed to essentially issue out a bond for water at that point? Essentially as a cash in lieu for other districts, essentially that district paying to other districts for their cash in lieu process. Is that a thing that is allowed or could be allowed with the way things are currently written?
I'm not sure I understand the hypothetical.
So they would essentially issue a bond for the
To buy
cash in
water
lieu.
from us or from
Yeah,
somebody else?
for a cash in lieu, they would essentially issue a bond for themselves to develop further.
I think this question came up in the Metro District policy, and Mayor Karspec asked me about it in a different meeting. And I think I said, no, you can't.
Ours
But
was
I
related
think-
to the new policy, asking if the developer could use that to buy water.
To buy water,
Yeah.
and I think the answer to that question is yes, actually.
Okay. This one is slightly different about can they buy cash in lieu from the town?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I honestly don't know the answer to that.
Okay.
That would be something we'd need to ask.
Would- Do you imagine that being problematic? Because, I mean, even if it's a control district kind of controlling where the money goes, that seems like they don't have to do a lot of the forethought. They can just issue a bond or kind of rubber stamp a bond through and then use that money to come back and say, no, we're good. Now, granted, that's
Yeah.
at town's discretion, but is that something we want to be?
And I
okay
think there's a lot of nuance in that conversation
Right.
about the timing and availability of bond funding. There's a practical limit to how much bond debt a district can issue when there's no assessed value, right? And
True.
so the houses have to get built first,
Sure.
so
Oh,
there's
yeah.
some assessed value, and then you can issue bonds.
Yep.
And by then, you already have houses built that you already had to buy water for, right? So it's kind of an interesting,
Right,
I-
so-
I don't know, it's an odd question. I'd have to-
Chicken and egg.
Nobody's
possible.
done it that I know of, but
I'm sure they'll figure out a way if it's profitable.
everybody does.
Yep.
So there's always a way, right? There's always a loophole.
Yeah, and I would think that the reason that I have not heard of that happening yet, and I think the reason is kind of what Chris is getting to, that you have to make the payment first
Well, sure.
to get the
Well,
water service.
They'll
that-
ante up for the first plat, but then after that, they're like, oh, hey, look, guys, we got a water park, we're gonna build a water park, we gotta build a bond for it, so we're gonna bond it out, and next thing you know, my concern essentially is it's not actually, you're paying credit card with a credit card
Sure,
and using cash in lieu
right.
abusively like that kinda goes beyond what I think we would be comfortable with.
Right, and that would be a deviation from the current town code, so that would require a specific, agreement with that metro district or.
Yeah, and I do think the one
Yeah,
caveat to all of that is there's a distinction between what they do,
Sure.
right? When we get the check for cash in lieu, we don't know where that money came from, right? That could come from private equity, could have come from somebody's private savings account. It could have come from a bond issue. I don't know. We don't ask. And so what matters to us is, did you provide enough money for the water that you're buying, and are we okay selling that much? Not so much where it came from.
Okay.
The question about whether or not they're allowed to do that, I honestly don't know.
Okay.
And I don't know in the context of Metro District policy if we should prohibit that. It's a good question.
It's just one that just kinda came to me, like, if you can just keep paying to play and just keep building it out,
Yeah.
having the last district kind of upfront on a bond
I'd have
for
to,
cash in lieu.
I'd have to ask Charles Norton probably,
Sure.
because I think it's more of a Metro District question than it is a water question, but it's a
Totally.
good question.
Yeah, bit of in the weeds, so apologies for
Yeah,
the
that's okay.
sidetrack
It's
on
an
that.
interesting question. I never thought of it.
Pete, can I clarify the question?
Sure.
So all of these numbers are based on the assumption that we're going to have 12,000 square foot lots. And there are a lot of different factors that come into the calculation. So if we're going to have smaller lots or less outdoor watering, if we have a non-potable system or other water conservation measures that are put into a development, that's actually going to stretch our portfolio so that it actually lasts longer for more development. So it's important to put those water saving mechanisms into the development in order to stretch. So there's lots of different, factors that are going into this. If we base it on the 12,000 square foot lot, then that's just like a test tube or a test case, a test basis. Is that?
That's right. I mean, the code does provide adjustments, by lot size, so requires more water for larger irrigated lots. And there is a small incentive for, small lots below, 3,500 square feet are actually 0.75 SFE under the code. And then there's a whole, different section that applies for non-potable systems. So if they are employing non-potable irrigation, then roughly you have half an SFE for indoor potable use for each lot. And then the outdoor irrigation requirements are based again on lot size and number of SFEs. So there are, and then the price for cash in lieu for non-potable water is half of the price for cash in lieu payment for potable water. So there's an incentive to develop those types of systems as well. So it's fairly well catered to those adjustments and the conservation measures that are realized for SFEs based on those types of adjustments to lot size or non-potable irrigation requirements. But you're right that there is some, there's a little bit of a buffer to make sure that the town is always, realizing enough water dedication or cash in lieu calibrated to the actual unit demand for that particular type of building product.
And I do think it's important to know that, like, and Pete kind of alluded to it before, but one of the ways that we check, is 0.4 acre feet per SFE enough, is we look at, well, how much water do we actually deliver? How much water do we actually sell to customers? We know how many customers we have in town. It's a pretty easy calculation, right? You get 5,000 plus, single residential customers, and we sold X amount of water, and how much water did that equate to per customer, which we can assume in general are all SFEs, right? Because we only have that. Now we've got a variety of products, but before it was, anyway, and that number is less than 0.4 acre feet. It's close, like 3.36, I think, 0.37. But that way we know, like, we're in the right ballpark, right? Like this is an appropriate amount.
That's coming from their meter?
Yeah, it's how much we actually sold to them, how much they actually pulled through the meter at the end.
At the end.
And that accounts for all the system losses, right? Because, we also know how much we produced, right? So we know how much we produced, we know how much we delivered. We can deal with those system losses, and then we can spread that out across all the customers and say, is this the right check?
So there's gotta be some system loss. So, okay.
There is system
If we're
loss.
at 0.4, then you had to put 0.5 in somewhere to get 0.4 out at the head, or at the house.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
But 0.4 is not the amount
That's not the
being
amount
consumed
that's
at the house.
being
It's
consumed at
lower.
the house. It's much lower than that.
So the
Not much
0.4
lower.
accounts for the system
Accounts for
losses,
system losses.
types of losses.
But I do think it was an interesting point, because if we're looking forward, traditional Colorado development might be 0.4, but if we were to go the way of, say, like Aurora Water, where they've, completely outlawed, turf grass in the front yard, they're, limiting or containing what can go in the backyard to like 500 square feet.
Now they're going after geese because they're associated with water. I'm serious, that article was crazy.
0.3 or 0.25 or something like that.
Sure. Yeah, that's right. And yeah, I probably shouldn't speak off the cuff, but the town's actual water consumption per tap it may be less than 0.3 even, but it's a fair amount lower than 0.4. It's just you have the system losses and
Yeah.
other factors that you have to account for there. And then, of course, there's the sort of cushion factor too, right?
Absolutely, that's
Just
great.
within an SFE, one user may use 0.15 and another user may actually use,
Sure.
0.7, right? So it's just people use water in various degrees of efficiency as
Right.
well.
And not to belabor that point, but I think I've shared this before, but I had my assistant go through and just randomly select a whole bunch of lots out of town. And then, create a little analysis of how big the house is based on the building permit, how big the lot size is based on the plat. when was it built? There is a very clear direct correlation between the size of the lot and the type of landscaping. The age of the house has very little to do with it, and that makes sense because like a lesser portion of that water that's getting used is indoors, right?
Yeah.
But it's really interesting. We actually picked 3 that just were like happened to be on the same street, just randomly as we we're kind of pulling accounts out of the 75 or whatever you grabbed. And we noticed they were on the same street, so we're like, oh, let's pull them up. Well, they happen to be exactly the same size lot, like within less than 100 square feet difference. They were almost exactly the same size house, and it was hilarious to look at the satellite photo. One had like a nice front yard and a little bitty kind of grass yard with like trees and bushes and whatever. One had kind of a much larger backyard of turf, and then one had all turf. And their water usage was exactly what you would expect based on looking at their satellite photo. I mean, like it was like a third, a half, and like a whole amount, right? Like it was really fascinating. So
Yeah, and that's why, one of the reasons why using lot size, and then I'll get into a little more detail about the review of, landscaping plans for common areas that aren't within lots. But it's generally a really good benchmark to use for overall water demand, for a specific area. So that's why those are really the factors that the town code uses to determine what the water demand is going to be with any development proposal that they're looking at.
Could the number of kids impact that?
I don't think, I'll be honest, I think the answer to that is in a very minor way.
Yeah, I mean, to Chris's point, the biggest
Depends if you have
driving
daughters or
factor is
sons,
really the irrigated landscaping, right? And so you can't flush enough toilets or take long enough showers to, really make a huge dent in that number compared to, having a 100% turf lot versus like a zero escape lot or something like that.
And a lot more of it has to do with watering practices too, right? Like we don't have any control over, but like in my old neighborhood, my next door neighbor and I had almost the same size lot, and my water bill was almost half his, even though both of us had pretty similar landscaping. But he watered his like, 40 minutes a day every day, and I watered mine 30 minutes a day, 3 times a week. And my grass was green and his grass was green, but he spent a whole lot more on water than I did.
Are you
Might have
gonna
been soggy.
talk a little about the non-potable water, because I'm curious even where the sources of that are and how that's handled and.
Sure. I wasn't gonna talk about a lot of detail about that, and actually we're working on kind of an update to the non-potable system master plan right now. We're just starting that effort, so you'll get a lot more of those details through that master planning effort,
But could a metro district have non-potable separate from the program?
Yes.
Yeah.
And currently, there are several projects that have non-potable systems, and they're managed by the Metro District or the HOA for that subdivision.
They just may or may not be functional.
One of them is not functional. One of them is very functional and very well designed and seems to be pretty useful. But yes, one of them is, all the parts are in place.
Right. Just
Didn't use it last year. And we'll be using it this year, and it's a long story.
Planner Johnson's point though of future water savings. I know Aurora or Arvada, forgot which one.
I mean, Aurora is the
Aurora's-
most recent example with
okay.
a non-functional turf ban.
Eventually, we would wanna adjust our cash in lieu or our water dedication lower, right? So.
If
fair to
we
them.
decided to go down that road.
Right, so the idea that we'd have more of a savings, or I don't know if that was even implying Planner Johnson, but we really probably wouldn't, we would require less.
I do think we would probably require less, but I think we'd still be really conservative, and here's why. Once landscaping is installed, if you've got a backflow and an irrigation service outside, that house might have, a low water use lawn or a low water use landscape for 5 years, and then somebody comes in and swaps it all out, 100% turf, and their water bill skyrockets and their amount of water use goes up. And so there would have to be very strict controls in place for those lots. And you could do some of that through water rate, like Little Thompson Water District has an urban tap. And the idea is that when you pay for that tap, you're buying less water, but you also get extremely penalized when you go over your allotted amount for the year on your water rate. So we'd have to have some of those measures in place to make sure that.
Right, okay.
But we'd still want to have, I think, a fair cushion there.
Sounds like old time cell phone billing.
Okay,
Don't water on Saturdays, guys. I don't have weekend.
and that's is all in,
It is like
under the
old-
condition that
It is like old cell phone.
And there's also a
that would pass.
just a general risk evaluation too, right? Of if you really tailor the unit demand that you recognize in the code and require for water dedication or cash in lieu, very, very closely to what your actual unit demand is, that you've determined through sophisticated engineering analysis, then, and by virtue of that, you now say, oh, we actually have 300 more acre feet in our portfolio than we thought we did, so we can issue that many more commitments. Well, obviously, you're getting closer to that risk of overextending the system as a whole,
Sure.
right? So that's the benefit. That's what I mean by the cushion as well, is that there is a benefit to being somewhat conservative in that, just to make sure that the town isn't overextending its commitments
Right.
relative to its supply, right?
Does this include, SFE, but are we including commercial in this? They're not required to dedicate water, right? They could pay a cash in lieu.
Yeah, that's right. And for commercial, the SFE determination is similar to what I described for like a water rights dedication, but those are looked at on a case-by-case basis, and the actual water demand for a specific commercial use is evaluated by the town's engineering consultants. And so, for commercial, the actual water consumption and demand can vary
Right.
greatly, right?
Restaurant
Depending on
to-
what
yeah,
type of
yeah.
business it
Or
is.
hotel.
Car wash versus a, clothing store, those are dramatically different water demands, so we evaluate every one of those on a case-by-case basis.
So we're saying 1,500 SFAs beyond commitments, but we should not think of 1,500 units, residential units.
Not necessarily. I mean, you can think of it that way, just in the generic sense of, here's the water demand of 1,500 housing units that all match the sort of, cookie cutter residential
Right.
housing unit. But as you know, that's not the way those 1,500 units are actually gonna be realized in terms of.
Yeah, I think we need to, there's gotta be some thought of, we're gonna have more commercial hopefully. So I understand, I'm just saying from our point of view here, to look at that and you think single family, you think residential.
Yeah, it's
You're right.
difficult. SFEs is just, it's the best way to sort of standardize a unit of water demand, right? And otherwise, it's very difficult. I mean, with commercial, like we just said, there's such a huge range. So the standard unit has become sort of the single-family house built on a typical size lot with, irrigated agriculture. So that's
And
just.
what about parks? There's gotta be some thought of parks in the future that aren't built by a developer, that the town gets in on, that might not have, we gotta have some kind of, let's say the south end of Wagner, if we wanna make that a little more wet. That's on the town to
That would
fund
be water that we would use out of our system,
Okay.
or water rights that we already own,
Right,
Mhm.
to
so
irrigate
this 1,500 also has to include some kind of buffer for future landscaping, future stuff the town wants to do, not the
that.
developer.
I think that's a fair point.
Okay.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean,
Another
it
argument
would
for the buffer.
eat into that
Yeah.
that excess.
And we've been working on converting all of our parks to non-potable systems. But it's still water that we own, right? One of our non-pot systems hasn't worked. It will work this year. The other one we used last year at Pioneer Park. Vine Park has a non-pot system that we had not historically used, but we're working on getting that up and running. And Richardson, assuming that we develop that park eventually, it will be a non-pot park as well, flowing directly out of Loveland Reservoir.
So this surplus of 1,500 is only treated water. You're saying that we have a separate non-potable, this 1,500 here, you're not including non-pot or something?
That includes all the water that we can deliver as potable water through our system.
Which
there
would be
is-
all.
We own some non-pot shares that cannot currently be used, like our Loveland Lake and Dishwater can't be put in our non-potable system, or in our, our Loveland Lake and Dish shares cannot be used in our potable system. And so that's the primary source of water for Wagner Farm Park, for instance, and that cannot be used in our potable system and isn't included in this number.
Currently, until we own more of it,
Yeah, but then we'd have to take all that through water court in order to use it as a municipal use
which was
outside of
part of the deal when we bought it
agricultural irrigation.
in 2017. This would be taken to water court.
We bought lots of Loveland Lake and Dish shares, and we could, and I don't think it would be a bad idea, but we don't have plans to take that through water court today, and it's a great
Okay, so that's
non-pot
not
system.
included in this 1,500.
I don't think so.
No,
You-
that's right. Yeah,
good
this
to know.
is potable water, only, potable use. Good, so you guys you really hit in a lot of good points.
So
My
I live in a pretty
presentation
big-
is maybe
slide
less
4.
organized than it.
I live in a pretty big neighborhood, it's all non-palatable for irrigation, so that 1,500 would stretch much farther. If you
That's-
were to use that bad example.
That's true. So like when a house in a subdivision with a non-pot system comes in, it's half an SFE for each one of those houses, right? So
Not, but is the
Yeah,
fee,
you-
but yeah, the fee is,
half an
the
SFE.
fee is still the same though, isn't it?
no,
Oh.
the fee is less for houses in neighborhoods that have.
Half an SFD, so you're charging 0.2
Oh.
then.
Like, it's like half for indoor, half for outdoor.
Okay.
right? So if you have a non-pot outdoor irrigation system, then your fee may be less.
But then, so you're saying non-potable even for your residential property?
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah, there
I
are
thought that
several,
was just
there are
parking.
several subdivisions in town that have non-potable systems to their front yards and backyards.
Well, I look here a lot about landscape, so that changes the game here. If we're just talking drinkable water, I mean, but I think a lot of this has to do with
I think
dedication
developing
for-
non-pot systems for future subdivisions is a great way to keep water costs low and keep the town green, so.
Well, yeah. Okay, so this discussion is not, this is just about the drinkable portion.
Primarily, now, there are subdivisions in town that don't have non-pot systems, right? So they're, the drinkable portion's going on on the yard too.
Yeah, or the non-pots for the parkland, but not for the,
Yeah, well, actually, in the subdivisions that don't have non-pot at all, they're watering their open spaces with potable water as well.
Right.
But we would need to do the same supply demand balance for the non-pot system too.
Correct.
So at a certain point, we'd run out of our current supplies. So we
Right.
would need to be pricing the acquisition of raw water for the non-pot.
yes.
Although like, you know, some of the subdivisions, they manage their own non-pot systems and they own their own non-pot water. We're not delivering non-pot water to them. They manage the delivery of that non-pot water through ditch systems and other things, you know,
Well water.
Gateway Park is a good example. We don't deliver that water to them. They work.
mess.
It is a mess. That's a whole different conversation we probably don't wanna get into tonight, but you're right, it is a mess. I think there's better solutions to it that we're working on. But there are those subdivisions that are managing their own non-pot system entirely. They own the water, they have it delivered to them, they pump it to their customer, they bill it. It has nothing to do with the town.
So for like farmsteads, is there examples of a hybrid, like, are all of our HOA or areas with non-potable, do those residents not manage an private irrigation system? Are they all managed? Is there any
Farmstead's non-potable irrigation system is managed by the Farmstead HOA.
but that, so what I'm getting at, this is also not just tree lawns, but this goes all the way into their backyard, that's being managed by the HOA, okay.
Correct. Yeah, they have a dual system. So they have a system that comes off our potable system that goes to their house. And then they have a separate system that goes directly to their landscaping that's independent of the town.
Hmm.
What
Okay,
stage in the process is that kind of figured out? After they've been through?
No, that all gets done really prior to plating, because part of their plating effort is dealing with infrastructure and construction drawings. And so we know if they're gonna have a non-pot system at the time, when they go through that plating effort.
And I think, Chris, correct me if I'm wrong, but for any of the non-potable systems that the town has approved, it's been, you know, pursuant to a development agreement that sets forth how the system will be designed, requires
correct.
town review and approval of the system itself, and then provides details for how the water dedication or cash in lieu payments would be made to accommodate the water demand of the non-pot system.
That's correct. They have
It's been-
independent agreements.
On a kind of case-by-case basis to date.
It has been.
I think the non-potable master plan that we're working on now will help the town take a broader view of that and generate some more numbers like this that you can look at on a town-wide basis and figure out whether there are tweaks that may be needed for the non-potable water dedication policy, you know, on its own. And if
Yeah, this kind of, at least for me, is a game changer here, so we're looking at 1,500 just for essentially indoor consumption.
Potentially, if we require all future development to have non-pot systems. That's not a current requirement, although you know, most of our bigger projects, really all of them, like Turion, for instance, they're not approved. Oh, well, they have an approved PUD, they've got an approved development agreement, different story, but they're planning a non-pot system for, at a minimum, parks and open space, and potentially a dual system to homes. Heron Lakes has a non-pot system for a significant chunk of that project. Farmstead has a non-pot system. We've talked to Ludlow about developing a non-pot system, and they have water that's suitable for non-potable use over there. So I think that's really the direction we're going as a community, and there's good sense to that.
Yeah.
There's no reason to treat water that you're just gonna put on landscape.
Well, I totally agree. We can tell the school district that too, right?
100%, yeah, we agree 100%.
But the problem with the school, the problem with all of this is just the school district's example is it's hard to maintain. So we have to be able to enforce that too, because
And I
otherwise
think
it'll break and they'll say, we'll get back on town water.
Gateway Park's example is a good one as well. It's very hard to maintain and operate. Those non-pot systems are a real challenge. It doesn't mean that it's not the right thing to do. It means that we need a better plan for
Yeah.
how we're going to.
And Commissioner Wing's
Support.
development has a great system because it's just huge pumps and designed for that. with
Yeah,
the golf course.
And
And they control it,
And-
control the timing, so they even control the non-potable that you're using.
And that's true with Farmstead as well. They have timing restrictions on when that non-pot can be used and things like that. Part of the reason why it works really well in Heron Lakes is they have an agronomy team. right?
Yeah, they're good. They're on it.
They have a whole team of people that know how to manage these systems.
That's what we should give the school district, is access to Aaron Lakes. Use that one.
Professional golf courses.
There won't be anything left in these reservoirs.
I just, oh, go ahead, yeah.
I mean, is there a way to possibly, as we think through this, non-pot, I think it makes sense, obviously, for us to possibly go there and require it, at least at minimum incentivize it. But is there a way to allow the town some oversight with that? Because these one-off community HOA managements, they're ill-equipped. They don't have the personnel, the know-how.
I would agree with you. With the rare exceptions like Heron Lakes where they have a whole bunch of people who are very qualified to run
That's
pump
the
systems and manage irrigation, whatever. I think the answer to that is yes, there is a better way to do it. Do we want to do it is the question, and I think it starts a lot with this non-potable master plan that we're working on.
Sounds like a business
What
opportunity to me.
Yeah, I mean, what we're talking about is the non-pot utility, right? I mean, does the town wanna build and develop and maintain a non-pot utility to deliver non-potable water to houses, businesses, parks, whatever? There's good reason to do that. But that's-
Examples of that? Do other towns?
I think Windsor has a pretty robust non-pot system and a couple other.
A municipal non-pot system?
Yeah, we wouldn't be completely breaking ground. I mean, there's good examples out there, and even outside of Colorado, there's some really good examples out there. So,
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
yeah.
I think so too.
So I think that's part of the conversation, and that's part of the reason why we started this non-pot master plan was to say, look, we own a bunch of these non-pot resources. How are we going to maximize them, deliver them to the areas where we can use them most effectively? And then are there areas along the way that we can pick up and include in that non-pot system? And what would that take? There's a million of those conversations I think that have to occur prior to us saying, let's start a non-pot utility, but that's kind of the direction we're heading.
Do you know off the top of your random or ballpark of what we own that beyond Loveland or with Loveland Lake that we can't convert into residential, that has to be non-pot?
I would say our Welch contract water is probably a good non-potable source. Right?
And that wasn't used on
Yeah.
Rose Farm, that's all non-potable, okay.
It was not used on Rose Farm.
Okay.
But like we could deliver that to Vine Park, I think. That's one of the, Welch has a very narrow, like a tiny area where you can use it.
Right.
But like Ludlow has been historically irrigated with Welch water, I think.
Okay.
The school district, the Heritage Ridge that was a missed opportunity in the past. I think. But all of these water sources have unique challenges associated with them too, in terms of, and again, I think Ken can talk to this a little bit more, but in terms of like when that water is available, how it gets delivered. You have to call for water and then somebody opens up a big gate and water flows down the ditch and you gotta pump it out at the right time in order to be able to use it. It's a much more complex system than like our potable system where we deliver to a reservoir, we treat it, we pump it into a tank and it's sitting there waiting for you to turn the tap on, right? It's pressurized and ready to go. Non-potable systems don't work like that currently. Not everywhere. So anyway, so some of that is like what infrastructure can we build to improve the availability and reliability of that system.
Can our cash and lieu fund be used for that?
I think so, yes. We've purchased non-potable shares that we intend to use for non-potable use. And so this master plan is helping us to figure out how to maximize the use of those shares. To me, that's absolutely a cash and lieu expense.
I think it's also system operation, because you're saving the system a little bit.
100%. I think there's real value to the actual potable system by taking that demand off of the treatment plant, right? future non-pot systems lessen the demand at the treatment plant dramatically. I don't know, Ken, how much do we produce in January versus August?
Yeah, I was looking at that, January was like 26 million gallons, August 90.
So I mean, that's the difference between indoor and outdoor irrigation, right? Two-thirds of the water we're producing in August is going on lawns and whatever, so.
It's a separate argument, but I'll make the cost for
100%.
beauty, you know, that.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's a cost of living here and.
There is, and I think maintaining a beautiful community means maintaining beautiful landscaping. That's
Where the gardens.
I'm wrapping my head around saying goodbye to turf, but I can't do it with
and I don't think we
trees.
should say goodbye to turf.
Well, we gotta worry about, we say goodbye to turf, or anything under it is gonna be tree roots, right? So we just gotta, as long as we have trees, it's fine.
100%. We need lots of trees.
Lots of trees.
We need limited areas of turf. We need really usable areas of turf, right? Let's put turf where it really matters and where it gets used.
Well, I think a family could make an argument that they use their backyard for,
And I think they should have turf in their backyard. I think we should. I don't wanna give them turf in my backyard. Just saying.
I don't know, I put artificial in my backyard and I love it.
Yeah, lots of people have.
It's turf.
It's turf.
It is turf, it's fake.
no, I think there's point, yeah.
And so it was mentioned that this, like about 4,000 SFEs number is maybe 10 to 25 years to build out, depending on the speed of developments. Is that a standard timeline that the town looks at for their planning purposes? I'm just kind of curious what your scope is in terms of long-term.
What was our plan? I don't know if Pete remembers off the top of his head or Ken, what our, in our raw water management plan, our raw water master plan, what our planning horizon was. I think it was 30 years.
I believe 30 years, yeah, to 2050.
Yeah. So I mean, that was kind of our long-range planning horizon. We're looking at what sources do we need to develop and maximize, and where can we look in the future, and how's climate change gonna impact all of that. You know, we ran 9 different models, different climate change scenarios, and all kinds of stuff as part of that master planning effort.
So I don't know if this was, I might be tacking on here, but how did we, at 20, whatever. So let's say Farmstead, this is true, said that they're gonna take 20 years to build out. And that was 2018 when they started, and they're not even halfway, but they're still, it's a fast clip for them. I think they'll get done quicker than 20 years, and they don't even have a metro district.
It could be, and so that's kind of an interesting, it's hard to predict the market, right? I mean, like when you think about, I don't know, let's say we got 5,000 SFEs here today, maybe 6,000. That took 100 years to develop, right, or 120 years. The pace of growth has increased, but then lately it's dropped off dramatically, right? And so how long does that continue? You know, we've been averaging over the last 5 years around 400 SFEs per year. And so if that average continued, and those are record years for the town in its history, right? Those record years don't typically continue over the course of 20 years, right? So you assume it's gonna be less than that. If it did, 4,000 SFEs would go in 10 years. I think that's unlikely. I think our historical growth rate is gonna be higher than what it has been over the last 100 years, just because that's the nature of Colorado and people are moving here like crazy and whatever. But it's not gonna be what it's been, it's not gonna average what it did the last 4, if that makes sense.
Right, yeah, those tons of backed up annexations all at once, yeah, okay.
I just have one more question, and we could table it too, but, so we talked about like the raw water plan, but kind of from the planning commission's perspective, we always are looking at the comp plan, or at least that's a big one. So you have the existing development, right, that, is maybe like the donut hole, right, in the comp plan, and then you have everything else, and that kind of represents the vision. So how many SFEs are yet to be built in order to fulfill the comp plan's vision? Because I mean, I know it's a range of densities per land use.
That's a
but
great
let's say-
question.
It's a fantastic question.
Say it's like, say you pick the middle density or even the higher density or something like that.
I think if we were just looking at population projections, and maybe Ken will speak to that a little bit. We just had this meeting like 2 days ago.
Yeah, well, we were looking at a 20-year horizon, yeah, it was basically with 20 to 30 years, the comp plan would almost be fully developed. Let me see if I can find the analysis where we turn the crank on that, and but if I recall, basically we would double
that 20-year planning horizon.
In that 20-year plan.
What is it now?
We think probably in the 12,000 range, you know, like it's hard because the census happened in 2020. And by the time we got those census numbers in 2021, we'd already issued another 475 building permits. You assume that's 2.5 people per house. And I don't know. So if the 2020 census numbers are reasonable and then the permits we've issued since then is probably around the 12,500 mark maybe today.
So if you figure like 30 people per house or something like that. you
We
know,
figure 2.5.
2.5.
I think 2.6 is kind of the official number.
Yeah,
It's just
then
easy
that,
to
yeah,
do
then
math.
that really does kind of compute then that the remaining 4,000, I think would.
For the current comp plan.
Yeah, for the current comp plan.
Which might grow.
That would probably be our 20-year planning horizon.
Yeah.
20,
okay. But yeah, we may.
Because we're gonna have years where we issue 450 and we're gonna have years where we issue 100, right? I mean, in terms of like SFE permits. And so over that 20-year period, right, that we're gonna have these ebbs and flows in development. I don't think we will see a situation, although we certainly could. There are communities that have. We're seeing 400 and 500 permits a year for 15 years straight.
Kind of ran out of land for that, didn't we? Unless there's a lot more annexations.
There would have to be more annexations. Really, where we're at today, we're built out, right? In order to develop a new subdivision in town, you will have to go through an annexation. There really is no empty land that isn't already planned and approved. And so, but you know, there are projects like Turion, we're jumping way ahead, Pete.
No, but I get it, yeah.
But like, you know, Turion is a unique project in that like its originally approved PUD from 20 years ago was 5,000 SFEs plus another 2 million square feet of commercial, plus parks and open space and all that. I mean, it's a huge water demand. We won't be selling cash and lieu to them, right? Like, not for what's effectively gonna be 6,000 SFEs or more, right? I mean, I don't know. We've got a lot of different planning numbers from them. I think we're kind of zeroed in on what that might look like. Those kinds of projects require a unique situation.
Right, because you want that commercial to get done.
You want
them to
that
just
commercial,
leave.
that's great, that's huge tax revenue to the town someday.
Don't want them to say, we can't dedicate you water because we can't find it, we're not doing commercial anymore.
That's right, and we've been working with them for years now on a solution that I think we've identified, but is still in negotiations and confidential in that sense. But they would be required to effectively participate in purchasing a huge amount of water that will not come from our existing supplies.
And is not accounted for. in
And it's
these
not
numbers.
accounted for in any of these numbers, yeah. Thanks, Peter.
All right, well, this is gonna feel like a step back now, but we've already covered a lot of this, so forgive me if I'm repeating things, but
This is fabulous discussion though.
this gets back to
Just
the
re-clarify.
sort of the factors relevant to the key question of, you know, what can the town do to use cash and lieu funds to develop or acquire new water? So, we talked about the water supply and demand balance. Cash and lieu funds, the town currently has about $30 million in cash and lieu funds that it can use for development of its water supply and new projects and water rights acquisitions. So the water supply projects that are currently ongoing with the town are firming and reuse of your Windy Gap units that the town has already acquired. So right now, the town, the most it can do is just a single use of its Windy Gap water, but you know, with the projects we discussed last time, you have the ability to reuse that several times over, which generates additional yield to the town system to supply for new growth and development. The change of the Handy Ditch shares and Ryan Gulch shares that the town has accepted dedication of already, and potential, you know, future acquisitions of those shares as well. And then Berthoud Reservoir, the upgrades to the reservoir itself, and then the upgrades to the treatment plant that we just mentioned, which make the reservoir itself much more usable and usable on a more user-friendly time schedule, right, Ken, than previously. And then, of course, just getting to what we just talked about in detail, the extent of non-potable irrigation system development, not to the extent that that is, you know, accounted for in this demand, but to the extent that the more you develop and use efficiently a non-potable system, the more you're trimming down on your potable water use, and so you're freeing up potential yield from your potable system through those kinds of incentives and measures. And so, yeah, the 2,500 additional SFEs number is really a pretty conservative number when you consider the totality of these projects, but I didn't want to go overboard with future projections. So I went with the conservative 2,500 SFE number for the total from the sort of current projects that the town has in the queue and that we continue working on. And then with respect to water rights acquisitions, most of you probably remember that the town acquired another 50 CBT units last year. And then the year before, we were able to acquire a couple of additional handy shares as well that are part of the change case that we're starting very soon in the water court process. So getting to the price element, and again, we've gone over a lot of this already, but the town's current cash in lieu fee is $25,000 per SFE. That was changed last year. If memory serves, it might have been before so that was increased last year from $16,500 per SFE. That equates to a $62,500 per acre foot. That's using that 0.4 acre foot per SFE conversion value. And so, again, getting to the key question here is, what is the actual cost of developing or acquiring new water for the town? And to determine that, we look at the unit cost of the town's water supply projects and the unit cost of water rights acquisitions. So some rough examples here are, in the not too distant past, CBT could be acquired for less than $20,000 per SFE. Now it's about $45,000 per SFE to acquire CBT on the open market. So that has increased greatly. And with respect to handy shares, currently the market is about where the town can acquire and use those shares for in a range of about maybe $20,000 to $22,000 per SFE, so quite a bit cheaper than CBT. So that obviously is on the lower end of the $25,000 per SFE cash in lieu value that the town is currently calibrated to. And then, but CBT would be on the high end, right? So again, just last year, we acquired 50 CBT units. You all will hear very soon, I think in a few weeks, that we're proposing to acquire another 50 CBT units. Again, so that is, this gets to the point Chris was making before. That's water that we're acquiring now that obviously exceeds that cash in lieu value that we're taking in right now. So there's only so much you're able to do that and keep your cash in lieu value, pegged to where it is now. But on the other hand, the unit cost of the water supply projects are much lower, like below $20,000 per SFE. In some cases, maybe closer to like $15,000 per SFE.
That's the cost with you too, with you taking this to water court.
Right, yeah, well, and what I mean.
CBT, you don't have to take the water court, right? But
Right,
with handy, you do.
Yeah.
Okay. So we gotta include you into this too.
Sure,
Okay.
yeah, and I mean, yeah, if you include all the, well, we've been negotiating with Handy to change Handy shares for a few years now, so.
More than a decade.
We're hopefully doing a lot of the legwork up front, and that will become more efficient as we, continue to potentially acquire shares in the future. But what I'm getting to, Mayor Karspec, is the cost of the water supply projects themselves. So like, for example, the Windy Gap firming and reuse project, right? Those are often a much lower unit cost to develop that part of the town's water supply. And so that's one reason why, as we stand here today, I feel like the town you're pretty squarely in the middle overall when you look at a sort of regional comparison of where other similar communities are in their cash in lieu values. And I think it's pretty well calibrated to the cost of the water supply development projects that we have going on right now. And then also the cost of occasionally going out and purchasing a chunk of CBT when it becomes available. So I think you're still pretty well calibrated to where the market is and where those unit costs are overall. So I think we already talked a lot about this one too, but with respect to the timing, under the town code, the general thing to remember is for both residential and commercial, the water dedication or cash in lieu payment is required prior to the issuance of a building permit. So this gets to what we were saying earlier, that a development may get plat approval, but may not yet pay the actual cash in lieu payments or dedicate water until they actually need to start issuing, or they need the town to start issuing building permits for that development. And they won't be able to get those building permits until the water dedication piece is satisfied. And then for common area irrigation, we talked a little bit about this before, but for any areas within a development that are not specifically within, private lots in that development, so any common areas, which would include, parks and playing surfaces and things like that, any sort of large irrigated areas like that. The timing is that half of the total demand, so you look at a plat, right? And you look at any of the common areas that are irrigated within that plat, and that the total demand of those irrigated areas is calculated per the town code based on the vegetation types, et cetera, in the irrigated landscape plan. And half of the total demand must be satisfied at the beginning before building permits can be issued, or actually before a stormwater discharge permit can be issued. And then the second half is due once they have pulled half the building permits for that particular development. Then they have to pay the second half of the water dedication or cash in lieu fee for the irrigation associated with the demand of the second half of that particular development.
And the way that demand is calculated, when they prepare and provide landscape plans to the town for their parks and open spaces, we approve those. And part of that is they do like a hydrozone calculation. They say, here's all the different landscaping types that we'll have, and here's what the demand is based on our code, which specifies like a certain amount of dedication for different kinds of landscaping. And they total that up, and we say, okay, well, based on your demand, that's how many SFEs you owe us, and we'll collect half of that.
So back to that 1,500 on the previous slide, we are including landscaping, or we are including.
In subdivisions that don't have non-potable systems.
Okay, yeah, for open space.
Yeah, like so Vantage is a good example. Vantage does not have a non-potable system, and so they pay us cash in lieu for their open spaces.
Heritage Ridge too.
Heritage Ridge was one.
Okay.
They're already done. But
So that 1,500, in the future, we have to keep
that
it not.
includes open spaces as well if they're gonna be irrigated with potable water.
We are accounting for that.
Absolutely.
That's per the master plan of the whole project, not phase or plat.
It's per phase. They do it per filing. So when they come in to get their stormwater discharge permit for the filing they're gonna build, then they pay half of the open space within that filing, and then when they're halfway through that filing, in terms of building permits, they have to pay us the other half before they can get their 51st. If there was 100, before they got their 51st permit. If that makes sense. And when we think about that 1,500 number above and beyond what we've already sold, it's really like, you just think about it like it's a bank account, right? I mean, if it was $1,500 and each house was $1, right? But then open spaces might be $15 and a commercial business might be $2.50, right? That all gets deducted out of the same bank account, right? And so it just depends on, that SFE number is, in the easiest way I could describe it, is like this is how much we have in the savings account.
Yeah, that's the crux of this all, and we don't know what's to come with commercial.
Yeah,
I
but
mean,
we also are.
Lodging has always been a huge thing. That takes a lot of water, and I think there's nothing wrong with incentivizing that.
100%.
So I think the allocation, our tracking of where we're gonna use these things.
But for us, it doesn't really make any difference because we can't really predict who's gonna use it 5 years from now, right? It might be a house or it might be a 5-star French restaurant.
No, if we want Walt to go out and say, you gotta go look for Marriott's, or Hilton's and stuff. We can give you 200 acre foot.
We definitely wanna have
for them to incentivize them.
We wanna have a robust enough system that it does not create a limit on economic development.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So we just gotta take 100 or so, I mean, I'm just saying, lodging is what we need, and that takes a lot of water, so we need to take that out of the equation.
And we wanna make sure, a 200-room hotel is probably 100 SFEs, right? I mean, like our multifamily number is a half SFE per unit. So like if it was a 200-room, or if it was a 200-unit apartment complex, that's 100 SFEs. So I mean, I'm throw a number out for a hotel, I don't know, we'd have to evaluate that hotel, right? But,
Longer
but you're
showers.
right, there's,
Swimming pool.
yeah, I take very long
You
showers.
don't pay the utility bill at a hotel, you just leave
That's,
the
that's
shower. going.
exactly right, you just get in there and turn it, and the hot water never goes away, so it's, anyway. Yeah, so I mean, you have to kind of, you have to be mindful of that in that long-term planning. number.
Yeah, I
But
think-
that 1,500 number, you gotta remember, is not a finite number, right? We're playing this, I am gonna wax poetic, I said I wasn't going before, this is what I was gonna say. I don't know if anybody knows who Simon Sinek is, he's like.
Oh, yeah.
He's got some great TED Talks. There's one about finite and infinite games, right? And it's really important that we realize we're playing an infinite game, right? A finite game has defined players, defined rules, and a defined end, right? Either when time runs out or I score a certain number of points, this game's over. What we're playing at the town is a finite game. And if you try to play a finite, an infinite game, there is no end. The rules and the players are not always easily defined and they change over the course of the game. You can't play an infinite game like you play a finite game. And really the goal of a finite game is to win, right? The goal of an infinite game is just to outlast everybody else. And it's continuous improvement, right? And so that 1,500 number for us in this kind of infinite scenario is, our goal is to keep adding to that well ahead of, the development that comes along behind it. What we don't wanna do is go, we got 1,500 SFEs, and when those are gone, they're gone, right? We treat it like a finite game, that's a major problem. And so I think in your point, we wanna make sure that we're not gonna sell off 1,400 SFEs and now we've got a Marriott waiting in the wings that needs to come in and build, and they need 200 SFEs, we don't have anything left,
Yeah.
right? Like, we don't wanna be in that scenario. That's why we're developing these water supply projects, that's why we're trying to purchase more water. And the goal is to always be well ahead of, the development that's coming along behind it, if that makes sense, right? It's that continuous improvement of our water supply and, in terms of the amount and the reliability and the resiliency, that's well ahead of what we have in front of us today and what's coming in the pipeline. And I think we're in that case today. We need to continue to do these things to stay that way, right?
Yeah, we either get more efficient or buy more water or both.
Or we develop the water we already own that we can increase its capability, right? Like Windy Gap is probably the best example. We own a certain amount of Windy Gap water. Well, if we firm that, so that, and basically what that means is we store it.
Right.
That makes that more reliable. We can count more of that water in the future for supply. But we can also reuse that water because it's not native to our watershed.
Mhm.
We can reuse it to extinction, right? And
If you're just drinking it, right? Not if you're.
absolutely.
Yeah, if
So
you're
the timing of using that water is important, right? If you're using that water in the wintertime, then 95% of that water is going through the treatment plant back to the river. We can take all that back out and keep it. If you're using it in the summertime, a bunch of that water's going on the lawn, you don't get to keep as much, right? You can't reuse as much. So there's this kind of interesting management of the system to maximize the potential of that water. But if you can do that effectively, then all of a sudden that Windy Gap water becomes dramatically more water than what we own today,
Mhm.
right? But without having to actually buy any more, but just building infrastructure and systems to be able to reuse that water effectively, which is what we're working on.
Yeah, I think
Does that
a
make
related
sense?
point is, with those types of reuse, development of those reuse projects and Windy Gap firming, it's really one of the more environmentally responsible ways to develop the town's portfolio as well, because you're not going out and purchasing water rights away from irrigated agriculture, you're not drying up farmland, and you're not
Thank you,
using
that's a
just one
clarification,
time.
yeah. For me,
water
it's not an
that-
environmental thing, cause it's already been allocated for hundreds of years or a long time. It's already been pulled from the river, but the saving of farmland, I think, is a great clarification, cause that's what savings can do.
Sure,
Right.
yeah, and
Or
just
the farmer sells to Denver, one of the two.
And maximizing the efficiency of your system, right? I mean, if you have the right to reuse water, then having the physical ability in your system to reuse it time and time and time again until there's literally none left to reuse, really allows you to, for every drop of water that's being imported from the Colorado River Basin, you're not just letting it go to Nebraska, right? You're using it until it's gone, essentially. So you're maximizing the value of that water to the town and to the system as a
Yeah.
whole.
And you're not taking that water off the local farm.
I still think they'll go to Denver, they're just going for the highest price.
Right.
Not like they'll keep farming just cause Bertha doesn't want it.
Well, that's kind of the end of my focus on the existing town code, and now I wanted to just mention briefly, alternative transfer mechanisms or ATMs. I know there's been some discussion about ways this might potentially fit into the town's water dedication policy or just, water acquisitions overall. And so, roughly speaking, alternative transfer mechanisms is a kind of catch-all term for a number of different legal options. But the basic idea behind all these types of options and these concepts is really how can we keep water in irrigated agriculture and owned by the operators of those agricultural operations, but then make it temporarily available, and the idea being that it would be available usually in under drought conditions or in prolonged drought scenarios for municipal use. So allowing an agricultural user to make a management decision in coordination with the municipality of saying, this is gonna be a terrible year for farming, it's not even worth me planting, so this is gonna be a year that I loan my, what would otherwise be agricultural irrigation water to the town for municipal use. And so, I've mostly considered this from the town perspective, just, for our discussion here today. But some of the fundamental risks that have come up throughout these mechanisms have been around for a decade or longer now, and again, there's the sort of various options as I state here, but some sort of risks and impediments to doing these transactions have kind of come to light as a result of them playing out and some of these transactions happening. And really the risks that have sort of materialized for towns to consider are the ones I have listed here, which really is, will the water be available when it's needed by the town? I think we've talked a little bit about how with Berthoud in particular, the town has water rights, the number one water right on the Big Thompson, as I just mentioned, and then also the CBT system. Those are really the backbone of the town's water supply. And those are both types of water rights that actually generate more yield, or at least as good of a yield in drought years. And with respect to the number one water right, that's just because it's the number one water right. No one else can turn you off, so it's very secure. With respect to the CBT system, that's a system that is calibrated, and the yield of that system that's adjusted annually is calibrated to the demands of irrigated agriculture. That's the original purpose of that project. So in bad water years, they tend to increase the allocation that CBT units are entitled to. And so you actually are entitled to more water in poor years. So it's almost a flipped incentive to what you would normally see with these types of transactions where, normally a town would have increased water demand and increased stress on the yield of their water system in dry years. So Berthoud's a little bit unique in that respect. And then some of the other risks for the town to think about is just, is it a firm supply? And you all might remember that term, firm supply, from the last presentation, but it gets back to something Chris was saying earlier, which is, for the town to make a commitment to water service, it has to know that that commitment is backed by a stable and reliable water supply in perpetuity, right? And so the town, just as a matter of planning, should not make that type of commitment unless it knows it has enough water to, sustain those commitments over time. And so with these types of transactions in particular, they're calibrated so the actual water is delivered in certain years within the period, but they're also generally limited to a maximum of a 10-year period. And so you either have to, renegotiate every 10 years with the same parties, or potentially go out and find new parties for these types of transactions. So if you're making water commitments based on this type of supply, there's a risk that you're taking on that water supply may not necessarily be there in 10 years or 20 years or 30 years down the road, depending on your ability to continue to negotiate that type of an arrangement for that water supply.
So you're kind of looking at this as a consumptive use, not something for backing up your reservoir or for treating a park that was going to be dry anyways. You're kind of looking at an ATM to drink with.
In that respect, yeah. If you're looking at it in terms of a firm supply.
Which I wasn't, okay.
Which really, Mayor Karsbeck, that kind of gets to my last point here, that in addition to the water provided by ATM transactions, there are other aspects of those transactions that should probably be considered too. You know, the value of maintaining irrigated agriculture, the value to agricultural operations, and then just land conservation values that are associated with those types of transactions too. So we're here to talk about water dedication policy, and that's very much the context in which I've presented this, but there are broader considerations with these types of transactions that are worth considering as well.
It would seem that there's some synergy potentially with our open space plan for farms located in and around Berthoud, where if the town could partner with like a Colorado Open Lands or, somebody who could, work through putting that in some sort of conservation easement, but then we had access to the water from a drought resiliency standpoint, we would fulfill kind of multiple goals at the same time.
Yeah, and I think I've spoken to Colorado Open Lands actually just a couple weeks ago, 3 weeks ago maybe now, to their land stewardship manager, I think is her title. Anyway, we've worked with her a lot on a couple of properties we already own that are conserved through Colorado Open Lands. And I was talking to her about a farm that's interested in conservation on the south side of town and suggested that we have funds available that we might be willing to support that conservation transaction if they could gather up enough money to buy the conservation easement. And we talked about the possibility of an ATM for that conservation easement, because there's good reasons to do it, especially in a conservation scenario, right? Because we want to keep that farm irrigated, and really the real value of a conservation easement is in the water today, right? And so you can't, if you strip the water off the land, and the land's not really worth conservation anymore.
Yeah,
So
for
how
an
do we-
agriculture, yeah.
Right, for agriculture, right? And so the conservation values are significantly diminished. And so how do we then support conservation through both using some of our open space money, but then also helping to fund an ATM that maybe we can use for drought resiliency. And I think her point was like ATMs, it could be a really good drought resiliency measure if you have to pull water off that farm in a year when you're low on water or whatever, but not as a firm water supply.
Yep.
But it could be a real help in getting conservation easements done, right? Creates another funding avenue then to help that conservation easement become a reality. And so I think you're right, there is good synergy there between our open space plan and our water policy.
Yeah, and pairing it with the open space program, really takes away that firm supply risk, right? I mean, you're talking about irrigation one way or another, so if the entire thing falls apart and, it doesn't produce water for 2 years, it's not the end of the world versus, making actual potable water service commitments based on that supply.
We're glad you made the point. That's a good valid point.
I have kind of a question related to the conservation. I lived in the Central Valley of California and during some of the drought times, and they did so many wells that they actually dropped the aquifer so low that the whole entire Central Valley sinks every year now. But because there's no water down there. What is the status of wells in this part of the country? Do we have big aquifers underneath? I just don't know anything about that. I'm just curious if that comes into play at all.
I came from the Central Valley also, and the mountains above the Central Valley, a little nicer. But anyway,
A lot
not
nicer.
much of it. But all of our water came from an underground aquifer as well. We didn't treat surface water at all. In fact, we didn't treat water at all.
You wastewater, right?
Yeah.
You
we
put it
treated
right back in the
wastewater,
ground.
but we had you pumped water out of the ground, you inject a little chlorine at the wellhead and put it in the tank. That was it. We didn't have a water treatment plant. It was great. But we don't have any well water here that's in our system. So
There's some.
Pete can talk a whole lot more about wells, but
Yeah, I mean, I could go on for
it's all
hours,
surface
but
water.
in comparison to California, it's been regulated more tightly and for longer than it has been in California. And so the basic premise is if you have a well that's connected to the broader, surface stream and river system, it's considered as using water from that system. So it's just like any other water right to, use water from what we call the tributary system. And then there's a whole system of 4 aquifers stacked on top of each other that are 1,000 or so feet underground along the Front Range that are a finite source of groundwater. And if you look at any news in El Paso County, you'll see that that's a huge issue down there because a lot of development was premised on use of that and was founded on that, and now they're looking at declining yields of those aquifers and the eventual, expiration of that water source and trying to manage that transition to a more renewable supply. As Chris pointed out, you all are very well situated. Your, water sources are surface water sources from sustainable, watersheds that there's no finite projection in the near future for any of those water sources.
Thanks.
Sure. Good. Well, so this is my last slide, and just kind of wanted to wrap it up with some of the overall objectives of the town's water dedication policy, and then just talk about, some conclusions with respect to the town's current status. The Berthoud Town Code actually does state fairly outright that the goals of the water dedication policy are to assure an adequate and stable water supply for all town water users. Also to ensure the financial stability of the town's water utility, and then just to promote the general welfare of the public as well. So those are the stated goals, and I think that's really consistent with the way the town has so far implemented its water dedication and cash in lieu policy. As you saw, the town currently has significant funds for water supply projects and additional water rights acquisitions. And as we've talked about before, and I hit on briefly here, the town has a lot of water supply development projects that are ongoing right now that we'll continue to work on and will generate water for additional water supply for the future. And then, as I said, I'll be seeing you guys again here in a few weeks where we'll talk about another acquisition of water rights. And so the town will continue to acquire water rights where it's, the right type of water and for the right price and makes sense in light of the overall development of the water system. And yeah, I think I just went through my last point without even knowing it. But the overall point I just want to make is that, the town is still collecting cash in lieu funds, and we have good projects in the queue to put those funds to use to foster, continued growth and development of the water supply that's going to be needed for those future projects as well.
Excellent, thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you for all the great questions and engagement. It's great.
I do want to touch on that 0.4 number just a little bit in that, so one point, and it might be for Ken, is that I cannot find the 2020 raw water master plan update. No matter how I looked on the website, it wasn't there. Luckily, I had a draft from 2 years ago in my email. So I was looking through that. And there's projected scenarios. I believe three of them had 20% decrease in water due to climate change. Is that the 0.4 we're charging? Are we using that 20%? Or if we're looking at a hotter climate, that 0.4 that we have now won't be 0.4 when there's a lot more evaporation, right?
That's correct, that it doesn't account for that adjustment in the unit demand. And I'm not sure what that adjustment is under the.
I can't remember off the top of my head. What we didn't do in the plannings, we modeled all these different scenarios. Less water available because of climate change and kind of what you might consider like drought. Also less water available because increased demand for irrigation or farming as a result of hotter temperatures, right? So like these there's a couple dials that get turned in those modeling scenarios. And and I have to go back and
yeah, I would like
we'll make sure that's on the website, especially on the new website. It should be up there if it's not.
So I'd like to see how we're accounting for, we might need to irrigate more our landscape, not just farmers, but us too. And the reservoir will be evaporating even more unless things get colder.
Yep, or unless you implement other measures to reduce evaporation.
The California balls on it?
Yeah. They do work. They also limit algae growth.
Yeah, I'd say I'm also interested in that kind of information being, but yeah, so just a little bit about my day job. I'm a climate scientist at NCAR, and I help advise the Army Corps on like basin scale water planning for
So you're tailored fit for tonight.
Well, I work on a much different, more coarser resolution than Berthoud municipality, but yeah, I think I've really enjoyed the conversation, and I certainly would like to know more about how that kind of resiliency planning,
Because you guys are probably looking at higher temperatures and how that affects your water supply, right?
Yep, and so there are multiple factors that go behind that, not just higher temperatures, but like you mentioned, the kind of evapotranspiration processes that deal a lot with the kind of land use that's happening in a particular area, and also changes in snowpack in the mountains, and the capacity of the atmosphere to hold water vapor. So it's a little bit more nuanced than just increasing temperatures, but there are a lot of scenarios that take those kind of scientific factors into account. So yeah, happy to help in any way I can, but yeah, I think it's really interesting.
Yeah, so I think we gotta look at that point forward, not just now, right? What we're gonna need, like Sean's, what was that survey you shared that was really good, the government one?
I couldn't recall it off the top of
Well,
my
you-
head. It's the National Climate Report or Assessment, I believe.
It's like, when do we take it to 0.425?
Yeah.
I think your point's a fair one, that we need to look at both, you know, as Pete mentioned before, we have pretty significant, we have a decent cushion, maybe I shouldn't say significant, we have an appropriate cushion, we think, in that 0.4 number. And is that suitable in a condition where water use might go up as a result of climate change? There's also a high likelihood that water use will go down as a result of climate change, at least on a SFE basis, right? And we talked about this a little bit last time. Like in the drought scenario, you know, there was all these mandatory restrictions we had to put in place in California. Like you couldn't water but 3 days a week, and you had to have automatic shut-off nozzles on your hoses, and you can, you know, wash off your sidewalk. I mean, all this kind of stuff that really we didn't dry up the town. Everybody maintained their landscaping, grass. Some people took it out because they just didn't care and they didn't want it anyway. But really, I would say that we kept all our parks green. We were able to kind of manage our way through that, and water use dropped by 30%. And so in a condition where everyone knows, as a result of climate change, that there's drought conditions, temperatures are up, there are other things we can do to keep that number at 0.4 or less even, without completely disrupting.
I think that's what we gotta be careful, is that your quality of life isn't gonna change.
And I think that's.
Otherwise, I think that's
absolutely
bad planning, if we're just saying,
Yeah,
things will get hotter, we're gonna have to put restrictions in on you.
I would agree with
We
that.
could have fixed that 10 years ago if we thought ahead.
I think there's some truth to that, yeah.
Well, things
And
are
I think a
more
lot of that
efficient
is
too, right?
maintaining an appropriate cushion in our water supply, right? If we only have enough water for who we have today, then when we have less water or demand increases, because of any factor, it could be climate change or any other thing, we have to put mandatory restriction in place, right? So we wanna make sure that our water supply that we have available to us is much, that there's a large cushion, like there is today, right? We're selling that cushion and then we're developing more, but we need to keep that cushion so that we can manage our way through drought. Because we still have more water than we need today.
Yeah, so I think, yeah, it'd be great to see that, how that addressed, you know, the Reagan thing, trust but verify, I'd love to see it, you know?
Yeah, sure.
And also the evapotranspiration, that kind of stuff, you know?
And just to expand on that a little bit, so I think that as the planning commission hasn't had water policy direct our decisions, we have seen it come up in public comment a lot.
That's big, why you guys are here tonight too, is that you guys get hit hard, and so, you do too.
It's
You get the same questions though,
It's
yeah.
really, yeah, and I'm sure you guys see it too. It's really interesting to see how aware people are of this problem and anticipate that in the future. And so I mean, that was gonna be one of my other questions to bring tonight, was advice on the scope of the planning commission and how we field those kinds of concerns from the public, because we are seeing them.
And I mean, and adding on to that, and just like the public comments that we all received, I mean, it does seem like the town has adequate supply both now and into the near term. I don't think your average Berthoud citizen, or at least the vocal citizen, knows that,
Yeah.
based off of how
Well,
comments are phrased. you
And
know?
what information are they getting?
That's what
Are
I
they
mean,
hearing
yeah.
news from California and New York?
Yeah,
Whereas our water situation's different, you know? How global are they looking at the water situation? We really gotta micromanage it right here, and this is where we're at, this is what we've got.
Yeah.
So,
Well, and you know, I mean, my wife told me tonight, or last night, excuse me, when we were talking about the study session tonight, I was chatting with her and she said, oh, it's a good thing you guys are talking about it. I was talking to this gal at swim lessons and she said, you know, I heard the town's out of water. It's like, and she was like, you guys aren't out of water, right? Like you would have told me that. It's like, no, we're not out of water, you know, but like that.
As they're in a swimming pool.
But that gets passed around, right? Like, no, they don't know. I don't know where they got that information from, right? But like,
I mean, you do have towns
Yeah,
up north of
Yeah,
here
yeah.
that had to stop building permits because they didn't have water. to
Yeah, so
dedicate.
it all ran out of water
So-
because Denver bought it up.
Yeah,
Rhymes with beverage.
but, but it should, but every town's different, right? Cause every portfolio is different, so, but I think a little bit of, I don't know if it's folks at the farmer's market, you know, yeah, with like a board just talking about it, or, you know, we send out in the water bill, there's, you know, various information, maybe we could talk a little bit about the water supply.
Well, I think people draw conclusions when they look at their bill
Yeah.
and have,
Yeah.
you
You
know,
know, just to provide a
questions
little
about.
reassurance that
Yeah.
we're not just winging it, you know, because I think that that's what some folks think.
Yeah, and well, then, like Tim said, the news you get, you know, then you hear about Aurora and stuff, and they have a different system, you know, and
Yeah,
they're trying to do that whole, that's why they're getting off of any landscaping, because they're trying to do this whole circular thing, you know, or whatever, like a reusable thing.
I mean, I
And
assume
the
the
other
whole
part of
town
this is
tuned
just,
in
I think,
tonight,
just
so.
human nature, that they're looking for reasons
Yeah.
to slow things, to hold it up, right? So it's either water or traffic, you know, and you could say
Yeah.
both of these are gonna be fine, but, you know,
Yeah.
not
There's,
gonna stop them.
you know, the vast majority of comments come from people that just moved here 2 years ago anyways. I'm just teasing. I'm just saying.
So
I don't blame them.
what I'm hearing is, this is great feedback, and this is why it's so great to have a joint meeting with the commission, is to hear what they're hearing. And how can we arm them as a town with cheat sheets or information or direction on our website to say, point people to this information. And I kind of am seeing now how even in the mailer, when you see things like, you know, plant this garden box and save money on your water bills and stuff, people are drawing conclusions of, well, we don't have water.
Yeah.
So when really we want to be efficient and ahead of any issues, and we're doing these effective things. So I would love for us to create some type of more frequent channel and vessel for our commissioners to send, hey, we got this comment more than once or question more than once. We're not armed to answer this. Where can we point people in the right direction?
Absolutely, and I think, you know, the most recent planning commission meeting you guys had, this was a big topic of conversation, I know. And it'll be a topic of conversation for the board here shortly, in the context of the development review. And so I think it was a good learning experience for us in the sense that we recognize that you need to feel more confident. And that's part of the reason why I think it makes a ton of sense for you to be here tonight. And then we also need to work with I think we'll get together, Jeremy and I, with our communications specialist and talk about how can we boil down was a very complicated and nuanced issue, but into something that's easily digestible, that gives people confidence in knowing that like we have a robust water supply and we're doing the things that we need to do to stay ahead of that
Well,
and keep it that way.
in a way of a public hearing, that is really irrelevant. The question is, the real question is there enough water to serve that development? And the answer is yes. So how's the town gonna do 20 years from now isn't really in that hearing. Though, I see your point, you often wanna try and answer that long-term question.
But we're also solution-oriented individuals, so it's hard to take that comment and be like, sorry, that's outside of our scope.
Well, there's gotta be I screw up all the time, but I think there is legal consequences. It's quasi-judicial, it's part of court, so you gotta be careful of that, we're just talking about that development.
But what May suggested, I think, is fantastic. If we had something like that we could refer people to, that is a whole game changer, which we should know a lot of that off of our top
Refer
of
them
our
to
head,
the-
but we don't.
So you're saying,
Refer them to
you're
the
not
water
saying in a
meeting.
public hearing, you're saying if like I'm a planning commissioner and someone's emailing me or something, and I need to give them some information.
If it's
Or
not project
anything.
based, just general, like water questions, like why are we doing this or that?
But you wouldn't answer that in a public hearing, I guess
No,
my
and
point.
I think that's a good point. Like, you don't wanna debate that with the public, right? That's not, what matters is, does town staff believe that we have an adequate water supply to serve this project? And are we developing adequate water supplies to serve this project and future projects? And I think that the planning commission, in most cases, the easy answer is to go, staff, how do we handle water? We evaluate their utility demand, we evaluate their road demand, their park demand, and we wouldn't bring this to you if we didn't believe that we could serve in the future without degrading current residents' quality of life, right? I mean, that's the goal. And so, I think that's probably the best answer you can give.
Punt to
is
Ann.
just say punt to Ann. Yeah, really punt to Ann.
I think a cheat sheet is good just outside of it, and maybe, sometimes I slip too, and you wanna help people out, right? It's nervous being up there, and then maybe also just something out that you can put on the desk when they walk in, and just say, if you have any other, there's a good resource right there on the way out,
And I do think we can do a better job. I think having a dedicated page that has our water resources master plan, some really good, kind of easy to understand information that's primary, that's there, but then with a whole lot of backup information and links to like this meeting. If you really wanna know how this all works, we've done Water 101, we've got links to videos of those meetings, we've had this much more in-depth conversation about how our water policy works today. We should have links to this meeting that people can watch, links to our water policy, some basic information sheets with lots of infographics, that's the kind of stuff I can understand.
It is the same questions.
All of that information, and then that way it's easy to say, hey, look, the town has a really good page on their website that kind of explains the whole water policy and how all that works. And
Something that simple,
Yeah,
so
yeah.
that we can look at them in a straight face and say, there is enough water, here's the page or that you would go to.
That's right.
And then not say, or just trust us and be a little hand waving.
Yeah.
Yeah, 'cause everybody
It doesn't feel good for anybody.
No, yeah, and sometimes,
No, and I get that.
Yeah.
And it is so hard to boil down what you've all experienced tonight and other nights, what is a very complex topic.
yeah, and water is crucial, and sometimes we have screwed up, well, I don't know if we screwed up.
Yeah.
Now, our traffic studies don't always come off like we say they do, right? Like, things get a little more busy than like Prairie Star Roundabout, so.
Yeah.
I think when it comes to water, I guess we're equally diligent, right? But I see it's a high stakes.
I'll tell you guys, thanks for inviting us, first of all, I think this was great, and I would open any other subjects that we're able to sit on something like this, and you did a great job too. But there were a couple of things, first of all, just us being informed, like we just were looking at like a 18 home project, right, and in the back of our heads, with the notices we were getting, hey, is there enough water, just even for, maybe we don't address it in public, but just to know.
So yeah.
And we heard a couple months ago, hey, there are gonna be no more permits going forward, and and it's water related. And we're kind of going, oh geez, maybe there's something's, going on here, and we weren't informed, so this kind of dialogue, better communication, it helps our head when we're sitting there and maybe
You're
we're
talking
going.
about the wastewater issue, but it was a little.
No,
bit-
exactly
it was a
though,
little
right?
bit
But
field of
it-
like what the issue
Well, and the way it
was.
was communicated,
Yeah,
it was just, we're shutting everything down was sort of the dialogue that got to us. So anyhow, I think your points are well taken. The communication for us and keeping us informed would be.
Yeah, absolutely.
would be great, but even interfacing with you guys is, gals, this is a good venue.
And the goal is to gain public trust on projects and input. So if you guys, if they feel like you're not informed or we're not informed on what's going on, that trust there's a gap. And the majority of people are not going to even take the time to try and delve into a complex subject like this. So if there were even just 5 sentences that were the highlights, high level, here's what the town's doing, here's where we stand, and that way they can direct people to those 5 touch points and say, here's what the town's doing, what they're working on. If you have high level questions, you can ask staff, but other than that, the general public is not gonna get into it, but we do want their support and participation and partnership in projects. And so I think, these guys need to be better armed, and probably all the commissions. I think this is just something in general for me, it's time we work on as a town, is how to break down all the amazing things you guys are doing into really just some fine points that people can look at and say, we understand what they're doing and we appreciate and support what they're doing.
And also, great job on the water. I mean, coming here and hearing all the planning that's gone for it, and before you, the people before you, sounds like there's really been a lot of thought into this, and very impressive. So to be in this kind of good situation in all kinds of ways is, that's great.
Thank you, Pete, and I don't think we're done yet with our actual deliberations.
Sorry, on that point specifically, especially for information, I think from my point of view, and I think for the general public's point of view as well, to have the information stretching back to say, hey, this is where we are now, that doesn't really mean anything to a lot of people because they have no point of reference. But if you can kind of trace, well, this is where we are now, this is where we were 5 years ago, this is where we were 10 years ago, and that kind of brings up the point that you were discussing a lot, where this isn't a finite thing. So these 1,500 SFEs, that's kind of scary when you look at it that way because we're running out.
Yeah.
But if we could trace back, well, 5 years ago we had 1,300 because we've replaced more than we've sold in the past X amount of time. I think that would assuage a lot of that concern about how much water is left and do we have water for these projects. It's like, yeah, we have 1,500 left and we're gonna sell 750 of them, but look where we were at at a similar process 10 years ago where we had 750 SFEs and we sold 500 of them, and now we're even in a better position, right? So I think any information that's out there, I think it would be helpful to everyone to have a sort of reference point to know what does that information mean.
Yeah, I think trying to tell that story in a really easily digestible way is the trick, and I think we can do that. We just have to kind of put our heads together on that. I know Ann had some.
Yeah.
Ann, would you mind coming up this way just because the microphones are up here?
Sorry. So just a reminder, if you're, because I always, as a planner, red flag goes up. So just if there's going to be a public hearing, you can't really talk about the particular case outside of the public hearing. It's your job to look at the facts that are presented to you. So if you all as planning commissioners get questions about a public hearing before the public hearing, the best thing to do is say call staff. Call staff and Trustee Saraselli, the example that you were giving was great, that if, talk to staff, because as a newcomer, Berthoud has amazing staff. You are so lucky to have the people that you have today. They're so knowledgeable, and that depth of knowledge is amazing. And of course, then as elected officials, and even as appointed officials, you want to be able to communicate information to individuals and not have to say, I don't know, call staff every time you get a call. But the depth of knowledge that's here is amazing. I just wanted to remind everybody, just don't talk to anybody about land use.
Yeah, or just be
outside of the public hearing.
I would say, just be general, right? Like you can answer with a cheat sheet, just don't put the name of the development on it. Yeah.
Sorry, just overly cautious mom here. Thank you.
Trustee Murphy, did you?
Yeah, if we're ready to talk.
Yeah,
the
let's dive in.
direction of policy.
I think we're pulling out, and I'm glad we're going back in.
That's all right. Couple of things I guess I'd like to bring up. I want to thank the Planning Commission for being here. I really appreciate your input. Really appreciate the presentation that's been given and just the breakdown. I think that's a great place to start. The bullet points that we had at the end there for showing where we've been, where we're going. I think that's certainly maybe a webpage would be the place to start for that, and we can expand on that. But kind of looking at our future, and the cash and lieu system, my concerns revolve around kind of looking way out there. I think staff has done a fantastic job of kind of explaining and kind of working through the issues with what we have before us, developing our rights that we have already, while acquiring them as we go along and making sure we have enough money in the account. But talking about the scenario, I liked your kind of explanation that it's, an infinite game here. And that's kind of what my main thrust, I guess, is in future policy, is that, we have infinite ways to kind of work on efficiencies. We have, theoretically infinite money to deal with these issues. But in that kind of game, we're dealing with a finite resource. The water is what it is. And so when you game that out, who are our competitors for these finite rights. You know, we're looking at, you know, outlasting a lot of the smaller players. But how does that work for a town our size when we go against Loveland or Fort Collins or Longmont or Boulder or any other large kind of entities?
Water district too. like
Yeah,
Little Thompson.
absolutely. So, you know, my question is, when we're working exclusively with, money, you know, made available in the cash and lieu system, I feel like, you know, my concern, I guess, is that we have diminishing returns as we go along. And the money does not buy us as much as we go further and further out. And my question is, would it be prudent to move to some sort of hybrid system? And could we explore those policy options?
I think the answer to that is nuanced. We absolutely can explore those options. Would it be prudent? I think is an interesting question. And I don't mean to sound deflective at all, but I mean this sincerely. It's a lot like, I'll use the most simple example I can come up with. If my goal is to go to Hawaii and save up enough money to go to Hawaii someday, I can do that like 30 different ways, right? And what ultimately determines how I do that is a whole bunch of other questions that go into that, right? If my goal is to go to Hawaii, I can save $1 a day every day until I get enough money. I can save $1,000 one time a year until I get enough money. I can go get another job and save up until I get enough money. I can put it all on credit and hope I can pay it off someday, right? There's a lot of ways I can get to Hawaii. Some of that's dictated on like, how much time do I have? How am I gonna get there? Who's going with me? What do I have to give up to do all this stuff, right? I mean, there's just all these questions that help define and then help me select what's the best way to get there. So I think there's a lot of what I might define as prudent or reasonable ways to maintain a robust water supply. And I think that's the real trick in policymaking, right? Is saying, you know, a robust water supply, I can get us there, Pete can get us there, Ken can get us there. We can do that 15 different ways. There's all those other defining questions that we have to answer to say what's the best way to get there to try and address all these concerns. Does that make sense? I mean, I hope that doesn't complicate the issue, but
No, I think you're.
I think we have to really define the problem.
Yeah,
right?
well, I agree with Sean. I think Trustee Murphy, the thing with dedicating water is it's done, you know? If they could dedicate us a way to get the Windy Gap complete, you know, that we don't know a timeline on these improvement projects, you know, it's been years, it could be outside of our current budget, that it could take more years, but when you dedicate the water, we know that at least we're gaining that.
We own that water.
It's done, yeah.
We may not be able to use it yet, but we own it.
Right.
Right, and I understand that.
An important part of what you just said too is, you know, a developer right now can't dedicate to the town the ability to firm and reuse your Windy Gap project, right? That has to be an internal town project that's using town funds to produce the, you know, storage that you need, the wells, the
Yeah.
other parts of that
Right.
system that.
My point with that was, I would be more okay with just cash and lieu if they would dedicate, if we knew that this was, I guess, the way I'm trying to say this is that there's no timeline on these improvements. If we could put a timeline on and say, all right, 2 years here in October, we'll be 50% done with our Windy Gap reuse, you know, but we just keep talking about it, you know, and we are doing other stuff, but I don't think, you know, we don't know, and that's what's scary, is that everything else is escalating while we're saying we got these other things, but we don't know when they're gonna get complete.
I think that's a fair point, and that like, and I think that's the risk we talk about. You know, you asked earlier, like, yeah, I'd like to talk about the risk of cash and lieu. I think that's the risk, right? The real pro is that we are in control of our destiny. The risk is that we're in control of our destiny, and only partially, right? Like,
well, this is cash and lieu is great autopilot, right? We know it's coming in.
Yep.
It might be a little harder with when the handy starts and stops, but I mean, reading the Johnstown's ordinance was, these are our requirements, you know, if you can make it in this head gate, and then it's good, you know, I think you guys could define what's appropriate.
And I
If
think
that way we know
I think
we're
from a
good.
dedication standpoint, we have that definition pretty well, right? I mean, that's kind of what Pete talked about in the beginning. we know what we'll accept for dedication. There's other sources we will evaluate, right? But we already know what's suitable generally today, right? It's Handy and CBT. There are others that we may be able to use that we'll evaluate if you bring those as an option. But I think you're right in that, like, it's easy to say, hey, we got $30 million and we're developing water. Well, what if we never complete the Windy Gap reuse project? I should be fired, but you know, the timeline there is amorphous, right? Because there's so much that goes into that project, and right now we're in the defining stages, right? Like we're doing all this analysis work, we're drilling test wells, we're evaluating different reservoir sites, we're trying to figure out how to pump water out of the ground and get it to the reservoir, and there's all the stuff that goes into that. At some point, we'll have a really defined timeline. We don't have one today on that project. I can't tell you like we're gonna have a reservoir online with, you know, an infiltration gallery and pumps and pipes, you know, 36 months from now. I can't say that today. I think we have an idea that we're working towards, but like we don't have that firm timeline. And so I think to your point, I think it's reasonable to say there's got to be some trigger where we say, hey, we're tapped out. Now you have to bring us water. And maybe that's the scenario that we say, look, we're going to maintain a cushion of X amount. And up until that point, we'll continue to accept cash in lieu, and we're actively buying and developing more water. And so long as we stay ahead of that cushion amount, we're good. Once we hit that, the cash in lieu system's turned off, and you will dedicate water to us, or you won't build.
Yeah, one of the
And that I think
regional-
is maybe a nice hybrid scenario.
One of the examples is just gonna point out is that exact situation. It has happened with other municipalities on the Front Range that projects don't come online as quick as they were anticipating. And so they've put a pause on cash in lieu payments to allow the project to come online, and then they would, you know, would start the cash in lieu system up once that new supply is realized. But in the meantime, it's water dedication only because they need the physical water into their system to support any new growth or development within the town.
Yeah, just to, I guess, summarize, I agree with Trustee Murphy. You were just asking a question, but I think I would be interested in a hybrid.
I guess then that begs the next question is, what is that threshold point? And is that something the board decides? Is that something that engineers would decide? Is that something that staff would run some numbers on and decide, or?
I think it's all of the above. I mean, you know, it's ultimately a policy decision.
But it's gotta include the climate change.
We want to recommend to you, based on engineering analyses and other things, here's why we think this is the right trigger, right? And then you guys would say, we either agree or we don't agree, and here's why.
Apologies for jumping on yours, by the way.
But I would argue there's some benefit to consistency with a solid policy that's not moving very often. To just pull that out on developers and say, we're done accepting, you know, cash in lieu at this point. I don't know, it seems, you know, a little bit more imprecise for people trying to plan these projects and stuff.
It is.
If we were talking about some sort of hybrid model where we were forcing, you know, developers to bring those rights to bear, obviously it would be of our choice what those rights were. And obviously they'd have to be acceptable to us. But I guess my thinking behind it would be the obvious targets would be those looking to acquire the most SFEs in a bundle versus people, you know, trying to build a house, you know, buying one SFE, half an SFE, can't say it. So, you know, and what those numbers look like, I think we'd absolutely have to be very careful with, you know, if we did implement a policy like that. But that, from my perspective, seems like maybe the most rational place to start with a solid policy that would go forward for dedication. I'm not sure if the rest of the board agrees.
Yeah, no, I would agree that if
Agree.
we would set it on a specific number of proposed lots, a specific number of proposed draws would be, I think, more fair to everyone involved as opposed to just doing it a case-by-case basis. And
So you're saying like 50 or less, you could do cash in lieu, over 50, you have to get stuff like that?
Sure, like something like that, yeah. But kind of on that point, it seems like, and this might be just because of legal purposes, it seems like they can either do cash in lieu or they can provide actual water. Is it not possible to say for a larger development that might be moving in, say, hey, you're providing, or you're trying to build X number of houses, say random numbers, say 500 houses. Well, maybe you give cash in lieu for 250 of those and you have to provide water for 250 of those. Is that just too complicated of a process per negotiation phase?
We've talked a little bit about that hybrid scenario. I think there's a lot of moving parts in that, in terms of timing, and I think it's an interesting, and for what it's worth, our policy today is you can do this or that or both, right? You could dedicate a portion of your water today, and some developers have, and buy a portion of it. Or you can dedicate all of it, or you can buy all of it, right? So it's kind of, we have the ability today in our current policy to do that.
Okay, it seemed like the example you gave earlier was.
Yeah, it's not
one
or the other, they could do both. In our policy today, and we could restrict that and say you must do both, right? And then the question is, when does that occur? What's the right trigger? Is it 50 lots? Is it 150 lots? Is it 10 lots? Like where does that lie? When does that occur? In a dedication scenario, it's more likely that would be a platting phase, right? But then how does that get translated out across the development, right? Now does every development then have a special SFE per house? It was like, hey, I dedicated enough water for 250 houses. Now every one of those houses, or half of the amount for every one of those houses, now they only have to pay half that SFE cost for that development, right? Do you see what I'm saying? So I think there's some of those moving parts we gotta work through. If the board's direction is we want to require dedication as part of the development process, I think we can make some recommendations to you about if it's a hybrid scenario, if it's we wanna eliminate cash in lieu entirely. I think those are policy decisions, right? And they all have various impacts, right? Some are unintended consequences we can't even conceive of today. I don't know what those are. But depending on the flavor of the board, we can propose those policies to you.
And in addition to that, the reason I would lean towards a policy that kind of looked immediately at the largest kind of developments is because our estimation numbers get hazy. Further we progress out with these estimations and sizes of these developments and what they're putting in density-wise. So that would be my mindset behind it. But obviously, I think it's a very delicate thing that we need to take very slowly and step-by-step kind of way if we decide to dial this up or dial it down.
And I think, that's an appropriate approach, right? Like to say, to take it from that perspective of like, what happens when we do this, and let's evaluate that, and let's kind of work through those details. I do think we kind of have to be a little bit delicate, because we don't want to create unintended consequences. One thing, I've been told this, maybe I shouldn't even say it, because I don't know 100% that it's true. Maybe Pete would confirm that he thinks my assumption is right. Like when Johnstown kind of said, look, home supply is our primary source of water here, and you're gonna dedicate it to us, the price of home supply skyrocketed. I've been told that. I think that's true. Because suddenly you have very motivated buyers all competing for a very finite resource, right? And what we don't wanna do is unintentionally inject a whole bunch of buyers into a system that really there's only a few buyers for right now, us, Little Thompson, maybe a handful of people.
Wait, you said that us is buying that anyways.
Yeah.
So they would be buying, either way, we're putting competition on the ditch.
Well, if we're the only buyer, that's a different market than if there's 10 buyers all trying to buy the same water, right? And so I think there is, when you say, hey, developers, you all gotta go out and buy up water, well, they're competing for the same water that we're trying to buy. Now we have 10 buyers for one resource instead of 2 or 3 buyers for one resource, and that has an impact on price, right? I mean, that's basic.
Yeah, that makes sense.
That's basic real estate too, right, Jeff? I mean, you got 15 buyers for one house, or you got 1 buyer for one house. There's a significantly different impact on ultimate price.
Our market the last 5 years.
Yeah, that's our market the last 5 years. So what we don't wanna do is unintentionally create a whole bunch of extra bidders in the market that have either well capitalized, but also have significant pressure to get that water bought at whatever price they can afford, right?
And that just might be the reality, right?
So I think that's some of those are just part of those
Yeah.
unintended
Someone might
consequences
just
I
get
think we gotta
priced out.
evaluate, yeah.
But I'm saying, we're not pioneering anything here
No,
by
no,
doing that.
not
So
at all.
you could just talk to other municipalities on
Yep.
how this works. What are your unintended consequences,
And if you just say, hey, look, everybody else has to go out and buy it, then if it costs the developer, 3 times what we would have paid 4 or 5 years ago, maybe that's not our problem. I mean, I think that's a reasonable conversation to have too. But I think we still need, practically speaking, I think, again, the thing that's working for us from a cash and lieu standpoint is that we have the ability to direct those funds. We have funds available to then maximize those resources and do some of these water supply projects that we wouldn't have if we didn't have cash and lieu. And so I think a hybrid scenario, there's good sense to a hybrid scenario because we still need cash in the bank to maximize these resources. And if we only do dedication, now where's the money gonna come from to go then develop and enhance those resources? So there's that balance too. So I think a hybrid scenario, there might be some good sense to that. We've talked about it and how to figure out what is the right hybrid,
Or
how
we gotta do
much and
both,
when and-
you just we gotta get hybrid, but also raise the cash and loop,
Yeah, I mean,
So it doesn't
could
have to
be
be
a,
just split
it could be treated like an impact fee, right? Where you say, hey, look, you're gonna dedicate water to us, and then you're also gonna pay a raw water system impact fee.
Right.
For us to go build infrastructure. That could be the hybrid that we're talking about. For all intents and purposes, what we have right now is an impact fee that also lets us buy water, right?
Yeah.
So,
I mean, I'm a big fan of the hybrid plan right now, specifically that buffer threshold of, whatever that number comes out to be and anything less than that, developers need to come to. You did touch on a point I wanted to bring up of, does that mean the town starts backing off on its aggressive pursuit of acquiring more water just to make it more attractable to developers? And then the other point I suppose to bring up would be in terms of cash and lieu, we only recently updated the fee on that, and it's not exactly an elastic fee. It does have to change somewhat regularly, but up until the last time we did that, I don't know the last time it was touched. And that lack of
it's been changed
elasticity.
3 times since I've been here in 5 years. So.
But prices of water have gone up more
It
than
has.
3 times. And I guess that's part of the frustration is, hearing, these developers are essentially robbing us blind because they're paying way cheaper than anywhere else when we could have been making more off of it and they would be willing to pay for it. The idea is if we can't change that price, I wouldn't even say daily, just even quarterly, to reflect, I guess, an appropriate measure, that's where it starts to becoming more of like, okay, so the developers are coming in, they're trying to pull a fast one, and they're moving so fast, we kind of lose sight of it. And lack of flexibility on cash and lieu is part of the reason why it's kind of looked at like with, I guess, a little bit of hesitancy, because this number, it will change. Maybe it goes up, maybe it goes down, I'm not sure, but not addressing it as frequently as maybe we should, which maybe it's once a year, twice a year, whatever that number comes to be, then it's at least a little bit more hands on the wheel approach. So cash and lieu doesn't feel like we're just signing a blank check.
And for what it's worth, we don't see it as signing a blank check. We think the price we recommended at 25,000 SFE is what it's gonna cost us to develop the next water supply.
Sure.
And that's based on some big water supply projects we're working on and also all these projects that we're working on to enhance and develop our current water supply, those extra 2,500 SFEs, right? So that number we think is adequate. It is not adequate if our goal is to buy CBT water. That I will say. If our future water supply was wholly dependent on CBT, we would be well behind the 8 ball. That's not our future. And I don't think that's anybody's real future, because I mean CBT is a limited supply anyway, right? There's only so many units to go around, they're getting bought up. And so that's not gonna be the long-term solution. And so what we're basing our price on is all these other projects that we have going on, including acquisitions, and what we think that average cost to buy and develop that water is. Now, I will say, I think you're right in that we need to regularly monitor that cost and that price. And if we feel like that's getting out of whack, we gotta get that price up. But just because it's cheaper than maybe somebody else doesn't mean that's wrong for us.
True.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, just, a 3-year-old price, as water's becoming the scarcest thing in Colorado, we haven't updated it. That's where I think a lot of us were kind of like, okay, cash and lieu is really not working for us right now. a lot of people were hesitant on saying it's okay. I get that it's a resource, either A or B. You can trade one for the other and back and forth. Sometimes one's more valuable than the other. But when you have one at a supreme disadvantage to, I guess, supplying water, that's where it starts becoming more lopsided. And from the outside approach, it looks like it's less planned for. It's more like, we're just giving this away. We don't understand what money is, which was what the concern was.
And, well, there's a real practical, that has happened in Milliken, where that really was abused, you know, and you've been great with this. The person before you was a real, 12,500 for years was really bad, you know. And so you coming along
In
actually.
fairness to him, when I started here, the first CVT transaction we closed when I started here was less than half what it costs today.
Yeah.
And so, 12,500 was pretty reasonable for an SFE
And it
based
gave-
on what CVT cost at the time.
Yeah, and it gave weird incentives too, about you had to 50 or more to get that price. Under that, it was 16.
And that
Anyway,
stuff we did away with, that was a little weird.
It was
For me,
the-
it was weird, but I understand why they did it at the time.
it was a slash, right? It had nothing to do with water. It was an economic choice. I think that's
Well, and it was an
Mike's point.
economic choice for the town because it gave us this big chunk of money to go out and
Exactly.
buy water that we wouldn't have had if we'd have just collected 12,500 at a time.
Oh, I think it was a real developer incentive because they had to pay less. And the 12.5 is way cheaper than what they were, right?
No, they weren't. It wasn't way cheaper.
Okay.
But
Sorry.
it was a bulk discount. But it gave the
That's right.
town a big chunk of money to then go use because you can't do anything with $12,000 anymore, right? You need millions. So
So with these two, I can't say the name of them, but we got two big ones coming up. And two of the three big ones, two of them are on irrigated land right now. It would just, I don't know if they're the owners of that, otherwise they're gonna be selling it off and profiting and then giving us money.
yeah, no, I do think there is real important requirement that if that water has been historically irrigated or used for irrigation on that land, it comes to the town.
Okay.
It doesn't get dedicated somewhere else. Now, the best time to do that is annexation. I think that's, once you've annexed the property, that becomes pretty tough, right? And so, to the extent that we can work a deal with that developer and make sure that we're giving them credit for that water, it doesn't get sold off and go somewhere else, and they get value to us. We've had those conversations with them already. And they expect to use some of it for themselves, right? For their metric non-potable system. Or at least that's part of the conversation, so.
Both of those, because the other ones seem to not know where that water's going.
Well, I'm not sure which one.
I brought it up at the public hearing and said, I don't know.
Yeah.
That was Bertha 160.
And that is one way Berthoud's code is different from other regional neighbors is, a lot of other codes have a unwaivable requirement in that situation that those water rights must be dedicated. And here in Berthoud, it's, at their option, right? So it does allow the potential for that water to potentially be sold or dedicated elsewhere, and then for them to try to make cash in lieu for the town, or dedicate some other water source, or, whatever makes the most sense for that transaction.
And I do think that's something we can clean up. And should be, especially for future annexations.
Why are we different in that regard? Is it just?
Just because that's not how the policy was written, and so many of these projects were annexed and like Ludlow Farm, for example, right? They have an approved PUD and zoning, and it was annexed a long time ago. Their PUD has been in place for a long time, right? And I think a lot of people see that as like this new project. It's not. That project was, for all intents and purposes, approved, over decades ago.
It's
And
new.
so their annexation agreement should have said any water historically used on this property will be dedicated to the town prior to development. And we should identify what those sources are at the time of annexation, outline them in the annexation agreement, right? Once that happens, like for all I know, Ludlow sold off all the water they had and only kept a small portion of it, right? And they had a right to do that at the time. They didn't sign an agreement with us, said they couldn't, and our policy didn't require that. But future annexations, I think that should be part of the annexation agreement.
Yeah, and I think we should do whatever we can to try and, these current ones coming up, see if we can, a sense of urgency on that, because these are so big. And they do have water, and they might have already sold it off, but it's worth kind of impressing. That could really help us out. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's more difficult when you're not talking about an annexation, because the question then is prior to what?
I get it,
you
yeah.
can't
Yeah,
sell the
exactly.
water,
Prior to
right?
what, you can't sell the water.
Yeah.
But if you identify that in the annexation agreement, you say, these are all the water sources that have been historically used on the person annexing, whatever. I think there's ways to do that, but it seems like annexation is the right time to do that.
That makes the most sense.
I was gonna add, how do I phrase this? Would it be a fair assumption that in these examples, that these agricultural landowners, as we annex or develop property, our cash in lieu is more affordable than what the water rights often are worth at any given time that they sell off? Is that why we're seeing 95% of our cash in lieu SFEs?
I'm not sure. Oh, are you saying that like I can sell my water and then buy it from you cheaper?
Correct.
It could be. Yeah. I mean, I don't know that that's been the case. But it could be the developer sold off a bunch of water. It's also, if they sold that water 5 years ago, they probably sold it for a lot less than they would today.
But it becomes as a package.
But if they came and said,
Let's assume that
if they,
developers buying it to develop, whatever, mostly residential, like we've seen. At that time, I mean, this is what I've heard, is that developer, the landowners often retaining that or selling to the developer, and then one of the two are selling that at whatever market rate and then buying it from us for less. That doesn't make sense for the town, in my opinion.
I would agree with that. To the extent that people are doing that, yes, that's not a good deal for the town.
It's a great point, for sure, and that's the effect of the market on the water rights acquisition side of things, but I just wanna mention that it's important to keep in mind the other aspect that goes into that SFE value for the town, which is the unit cost of the town developing its own water supply, right? And so for the town, that still continues to this day to be well below the cash in lieu value you're charging. So that's where you have to strike this balance, is that the cash in lieu fee is allowing you to go out and acquire water rights, sometimes at a loss where those kinds of incentives could arise. But it also needs to be somewhat calibrated to the unit cost of the development of your own water supply projects to allow you to generate the funds that you need to pursue those projects as well.
Yeah.
So it's a balance between those two considerations.
But to Trustee Murphy's point, I mean, we have this infinite game we're playing, but water is still a finite source, and so to me, that's not really a zero-sum, I guess, scenario.
Right.
You know, if that plays out.
So I think we were talking about that. I think we also just gotta raise, it doesn't have to be 50-50. We can also just say, this is a separate, we need money to develop our existing supplies, and then you need to dedicate a portion here. But it doesn't have to be half of what it is, some shape or form of what it is right now. And if the developer pushes back, I don't know what Little Thompson is right now. I heard it was 70 for a tap. We're cheaper. It's always just kind of, you can go elsewhere, but I think they would still work with us,
And I think it's important too, yes, I think that's true. There's really only, again, there's only a handful of sources that we can readily use in our system. And there's only a handful of other entities that can readily use those sources in their system, right? And so, you might sell water, like we get approached all the time, like, hey, you wanna buy, I don't know, big Thompson ditch water or whatever, and you're like, yeah, we can't really use that. Like, it's got return flow obligations we can't meet. It'd be a real pain to get it here. Like, there's all this stuff that like, it doesn't make any sense for us. And so for certain water rights, CBT excluded, right? Because CBT is super usable for a whole lot of people. But like, there's a limited number of buyers that we're competing against. And so, somebody could say, hey, I'm gonna go sell this off to somebody else and come buy it from you cheaper. The risk of that is a little bit lower in that, like, unless they own a whole bunch of CBT water, right? Like if I owned 1,000 units of CBT water and I could sell that and make a gajillion dollars and then come buy 3 times the amount of water from the town.
Yeah.
I see where the concern is like, wow, they're manipulating the system, the town's getting screwed. The caveat, like I think Pete said, is that it doesn't cost us CBT prices to develop the water we already have and to purchase and acquire more water, right? Like our average cost for SFE right now is much less than what we charge. It's reasonable to charge that amount because we don't know what the future is going to be, right? But our cost per SFE historically and right now we think is in the right range. We have some buffer. So while it might feel like, hey, somebody else is getting this huge benefit, for us, it doesn't change what it costs us to develop the water. Does that make sense?
We're getting a huge benefit as well.
We're getting a benefit because we're getting a whole bunch of cash to go develop all this water at a cheaper price than somebody else is gonna go, pay for all that they paid for that CBT water, right?
I think we're doing a loop.
It's this kind of weird.
Well, I think we're doing a conversation. I'll just go back then and say, if we're not building a system, then that money is just sitting there.
Agreed.
Well, granted, we are investing that money, so it is growing, but the difference is when they dedicate the water, the game's done. We know that we have the water from the developer.
That's true.
I don't know if there's a right answer, but I agree with the hybrid thing.
Hypothetically, if we said cash in lieu's done, let's just walk away from it. We only take dedications now. In your opinion, how bad of an idea is that?
I'm gonna just step out from
Kill the
That's a loaded question.
The TV just says, "We'll be right back."
Technical difficulties.
That's when the picture freezes on the screen.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if I can answer that. I mean, just being honest, it's, again, there are pros to that system and there are significant cons to that system. There are pros to our current system and there are significant cons to our system. And so, would it be a disaster? I don't know. I really don't. I've learned over, almost 20 years that developers often tell you things that are not true. Shocking. And so, would that destroy all economic growth in the town? The developer will probably tell you that in a meeting here. I don't know. Maybe they wouldn't. But would it actually? I really don't know.
Crystal ball question.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's.
I don't know the answer to that question.
I mean, usually weighing absolutes typically doesn't pan out well, which in that instance, it's an absolute, which it was mostly just asking to see if is it even worth considering getting rid of cash in lieu?
I think the best way I could say it is that we believe our cash in lieu system is working today. Does that carry risk? Yes. Can we lessen that risk with a different policy? Potentially. But I do think our cash in lieu system is working. Sure. I think that's probably the best way I could answer your question. Does that mean it shouldn't be tweaked? I'm not saying that.
Sure.
For some direction here, I still feel like we could do a hybrid.
Yeah.
Do you guys feel that way, or?
I'd personally like to evaluate that hybrid
Yeah.
system and come and tell you what
I think
think
that's a way we can improve it and move this
Yeah.
thing forward to a different level.
And I think it's not harmful at all to look at options and say,
Yeah.
oh, yeah, well, all of the options that are possible, they're not really doing a benefit, so we don't, none of us will look at that.
It's not improving it.
Yeah, I think we should too. I think this is just my opinion, there's a sense of urgency on this too. I mean, I wouldn't want this to take 2 years and
100%.
both the developments are done. Maybe that, and then we didn't even discuss kind of the details of ATMs. I'm glad you even brought that up. I think that I would love to see that worked out. I don't think we need to stack them and use them for residential. And I know that conversation you had with Carmen and some of the downsides of this, but I do think there's a way that helps preserve open lands. And I think when we're looking at new developments and a lot of the water putting into the initial landscaping, we could use it for that too. We could do 3 years or something like that. So
That's an interesting scenario I've never considered.
yeah, I
Not
think
to belabor the point, but a lot of our landscaping is native now.
Right.
In large open space areas for obvious reasons. And it needs several years to establish, and maybe there's some unique, interesting ways we can do that. ATMs, I don't know. I mean, that's an interesting thought I haven't had before.
I think, yeah, that'd be good. I don't know how we're gonna have maybe a subcommittee on this, because it has been a couple of years where we throw this idea around, but we could get Carmen in a room and then maybe Broomfield and say, how do you use yours, and
Well, I think from a practical standpoint, if there was an ATM available to us today, if there was somebody that was interested in negotiating one with us, we would do that anyway.
Wagner, don't they have Wagner Farm, the new one? I heard from Carmen that they're allocating ATM credits. I don't know if
She
that's
didn't
true.
mention that to me,
Okay.
so I honestly don't know the answer.
That'd be
to
good
that
to
question.
talk to her
I
about.
do know that a significant portion of the conservation value was water and conserving that with the land, but I don't know if they took a portion of that through ATM with the idea that it wouldn't always be tied.
Yeah, that's an interesting question.
Yeah, that's a good question to ask. She did mention that to me in our conversation, so. But like I said, I think especially in a conservation easement scenario, I think it's worth exploring every time we participate in one of those or one of those is going on in our area. And we've got a great relationship with Colorado Open Lands. And then the question is, how do we then, outside of conservation, how do we then go and utilize ATMs? I think the other challenge with ATMs, in my opinion, is that as a farmer, the ATMs have really no value to them, because there's gonna be years where they're not gonna have any water on their farm. And the water's probably more valuable for them to just sell it, right? Like, I mean, like, in a lot of cases, if a farmer just says, hey, I'm done, my kids don't wanna farm anymore, that happens all the time. People approach us and say, I've been farming forever, my kids have no interest in farming, and so I'm ready to sell my water out. That, an ATM in that scenario is a challenge too, because nobody wants to farm that land, right? In that, at least in that person's mind, and they just wanna sell and be done. So but in conservation, where we know for a fact that that land is gonna continue to be irrigated and farmed in perpetuity, because we've placed conservation easement on, I think an ATM suddenly makes a ton of sense. So I think those are high priority, then we gotta figure out how to make those work in other scenarios, that aren't conservation related, if we're gonna incorporate them into our policy. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think from our end, it doesn't matter as long as we're getting the 3 out of 10.
That's true.
And you don't have to fallow, you can just use a drier crop. That was Carmen's idea, so.
Yeah.
I think just getting in a room with her and we
And
actually
that
honestly get
ultimately
some
becomes
farmers
the
in.
farmer's decision,
Yeah.
they could choose not to farm and.
Yeah.
And I think in the years, typically in ATMs, in the years where you take the water, you gotta pay them anyway, right?
Yeah, that's the Malchow one, I think was just weird.
So they're not totally screwed when it's not like they're, so.
Yeah. Cool. So looking into a hybrid, more information on the ATMs.
Fixing the annexation.
Well, I should say more information. I would personally like to see some kind of draft policy on ATM. Is that possible, or this might just come back again of,
Yeah, I mean, I
we
think
talked about
maybe a
ATM.
specific ATM conversation with Colorado Open Lands.
Yeah, okay.
Furthering the one I started with her a few weeks ago.
Yeah, okay,
specifically about
that'd be
that.
great.
And then if there's something in there, we can bring that policy back to you, yeah. And then I think we wanna talk about how to make sure the water stays at annexation. Water that's been historically used on that property stays with that property at annexation. Excuse me.
Do we wanna talk about just giving it all, putting it all on the developer, or do you see some truth in having the builder pay some of this?
In terms of cash and lieu?
Yeah.
I think there's reason for for both. The real impact comes when somebody builds something, right? And so there's some sense to saying, hey, the builder has some obligation to pay for offsetting some of this impact.
But for the water, if we did a hybrid, it'd be hard for the individual builder to find water.
That's a very, that could be a really challenging situation. Outside of
The
huge
big
merchant builders, you won't get anybody that's gonna go out and buy water. I mean, that's, I shouldn't say nobody, but like, that's gonna be a much more challenging scenario. For the builder that's building 6 houses a year, not 600,
Anything else?
The communication we talked about, just to add to.
Oh, cheat sheets?
Check,
Yep.
yeah.
Yeah, that we'll
And I
take
think
that
it makes
on
sense, I
staff.
was thinking about this, with our public relations or whoever. We get asked the same questions with every big, development. Maybe there's a growth FAQ page on the website or something to that nature that addresses all the big topics of not only water, but traffic studies and.
School districts.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, I do think especially.
Ospreys, I don't know, what else are we gonna do? Elk, yeah.
We only have, fortunately, we only have like one of these really huge developments every couple of years or less. But I think you're right.
Growth in general, though.
Just growth in general. How does this work? What are all the things we care about, and how do we evaluate those things, and who's responsible for evaluating them in some cases, right? Like schools, we say that all the time, like we don't build schools. We make sure the school district knows about what's coming down the pipeline. They have to plan and decide how they're gonna handle that, right? We can't force them to do that. They're a different entity. But here's how that process works, and here's how we keep them informed, and I think that having a standard set of information at every one of these hearings, I think makes a lot of sense, and Ann and I will work on that for sure. Just to say, here's all the stuff we evaluate, and here's how we do that, and here's why we're bringing this to you, because we've dealt with all of these issues,
There's a lot of thought into this.
And
I'm winging it, I think is, someone said.
Got a few comments where it just made it sound like we have no clue what we're doing up here, and that we haven't.
I get that comment every day, Tim.
Well, when you're saying something about holding up
How many study
fees,
sessions
that's
have we
happening in
had?
a certain area. So I think some of this is maybe based on truth, but for a particular development, and they're thinking the whole town's going through an issue.
And oftentimes, I I told somebody this on the phone just a couple days ago. And I didn't mean it to be disrespectful, but I've told several people this. Like, I hear your concerns. In my career, short as it has been, whatever, 17 or 18 years, all the doom and gloom predictions that I always hear never come true. It doesn't mean that it's always perfect. I will never say that. Like, there's always unintended consequences and there's things that we don't capture or that we don't evaluate correctly. But like, when people are like, the schools are shutting down and the water system's collapsed and it's Armageddon, that never happens. And so, like, I'm all about talking about like, what are the real impacts of development? How do we mitigate those? But the people that are like, you have no idea what you're doing and this town is destroyed and it's all falling apart. It's like, well, okay, thanks for your feedback.
Can you put a special section in regarding my view of the mountains and how you're ruining it? Because I think that's another piece that
But
needs
that
to
goes,
be.
yes. And I'll say that's true. There's an aspect of this that we
There is,
can't.
yeah.
It's
You know,
like,
development does not make everything better.
how long have
And that
we-
goes back to the questions people come up and speak about water. They might not actually be talking about that of traffic. What they're trying to say is, I'm frustrated by this and I'm looking for a way to stop it.
I believe wholeheartedly that in most cases, that's the case.
Well,
People
it's
are
like
less
the comment-
concerned about traffic and more concerned about just the impacts of growth,
Yeah,
right?
right.
And that's
And the small
an
town-
absolutely fair concern.
Small town feel.
Yeah.
That's the one comment that gets brought up a lot. I've lived here my entire life. I'm old. And to hear that they moved here 5 years ago because of our small town feel makes me feel like we're doing something right.
Yeah.
Because if we've been able to maintain a small town feel for the last 100 years, even with all our growth, we're
Well,
doing something.
we haven't had all this growth in a year.
But I know,
Very
but
few
what I'm saying is
Places are
like,
at 10,000.
even in like the last 5 years or the 10 years, everyone says, oh, we moved here because it's a quaint small town.
And a lot of
So
people
even at
say I
12,000
moved here
people, people still
9
think
months
we're a
ago.
small town. That's what
Who
I'm
wants
getting.
to be the last person to
It's like-
What? There's gonna be a date on the last person that says that?
They want to be the last.
October
person to do their
2023.
birthday, Be like, all right, I'm the last person.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's always true. Shut the
We'll
door
waive all
behind you,
their
right?
building fees because you're the last house ever to be built.
But in the context of water especially, and I think just in growth in general, I think having good information about like, here's how this works. And doing that tactfully, but in a way that's educational and that makes sense, I think is a great suggestion. And that's something we'll definitely work on. And
Our
hopefully
FAQs.
very soon. I think that's something we can do pretty quick.
Our FAQ page on new growth.
Yeah. I mean, I think we'd like to put together some nice flyers that are
And I
easy
could use
to
them too, you know,
digest.
I would love to.
Absolutely, just so that you guys.
When I get
have
frustrated about
numbers.
development, I can read them too, and, oh, yeah, we are good. I go back to sleep. Except for the school district, because that is not, we gotta hope that bond passes, otherwise. We can't make it
We'll
better.
have more portables at that point, yeah.
So regarding the non-potable water requirements for new development, is that something that would be a policy?
I think we really need to
Something
get through this
policy.
non-pot master plan. I don't know. Ken's nodding. Before we talk about major policy changes, I think there's some good reason to get through the non-pot master plan. And then I think that'll provide that framework for us to say, here's how we incorporate that more robustly into our policy.
In theory, it makes a ton of sense, because we're just throwing treated water literally on the ground for no reason.
And it
there's-
costs a lot of money to treat that water.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Get the school district.
There's not much left of that axe well. I don't know if we can
I'm gonna
grinding
keep
a
grinding.
stone.
It's hardware and buy another one then. Get a new axe. Anyway.
Well, I think we've got a lot of really good direction. I think it's been pretty clear, I hope, and we'll circle up as a team and start to work
Yes,
down those
and thank you for your flexibility and all the work you guys have done and on this tonight too. And you're always in the hot seat, you know, and you do a great job with it, managing us too.
They're always in the hot seat.
Sure.
Thank you for the engagement. It's great to.
Well, it's a unique community, you know, I think there is a little more pushback on development than you get on average, you know.
Sure.
Pros or cons to that. And thank you to planning and zoning too, coming and I think having more of these joint, we're in the same boat, you know, we're both doing land use hearings, so. The more we can do together, the better.
Do we have a date of our water 101 meeting? Because I went to go look for it, I couldn't remember the date.
The last time we talked water was October 11th last
Okay,
year.
that's what I
That
thought.
was our water 101.
If we could find that link easily and.
It's on our
Email it up.
YouTube, it's on our YouTube page. It's really
is it?
easy to find on our YouTube, or there's a link to our YouTube page from our trustee meetings video page. But the
That was a
October
good
11th meeting was the last time we did water 101.
Be good.
You know, one subject that seems to come up every single time we have one of these projects we're looking at is affordable housing. And just as I was listening to you talk, and we talked about, you know, unintended circumstances, if you make it more expensive for the builder or developer, they will pass that on immediately to the new buyer. So it's just, again, we have to take all those things into
Sure.
consideration.
But you as a businessman, wouldn't you charge the maximum amount you could get for your product, no matter what?
No.
No?
I think we had this discussion last time.
You have lost leaders.
If I had a grocery desert and I could charge $100 for a dozen eggs, I would not do it.
Well, that's kind of an ethical thing, right? Okay, you're saying an ethical developer.
You asked if I
Or an ethical
would
builder,
if I would charge the highest price for anything, and the answer is no.
I think some builders might.
In my experience,
So,
all
market-
builders
market
do.
value.
Well, there's a point where it's economics, supply and demand, right? You'll at some point, there is a elasticity where you price yourself out of the market. I mean, it's there, it's somewhere, so.
What if in a hybrid policy, there was an incentive to include attainable or affordable housing as a way to not have to do a dedication? And you could just do cash in lieu instead, or you got a lower, instead of 0.4 per SFE, attainable affordable housing had certain types of landscaping, so it was only 0.25. So I think there's a way that
Yeah.
we can have our water policy and
Help that out.
help
And we kind of
get us
do.
towards
Yeah,
other
I do
goals.
We
too.
did that with Habitat, because they're building those homes on the smaller lots.
Mm-hmm.
And that's when we created that smaller SFE unit for those smaller lots.
Yeah, we restructured our entire
Makes
fee,
sense.
we recalculated our entire fee structure to accommodate smaller
Over
developers.
kind of by the farmstead there.
What was that?
Over in the, on the east side of town, right?
No, I'm talking about
actually-
the Habitat homes.
Oh, on
We actually took a lot of their lots, cut them in half,
the Fourth
so we
Street.
could put their little single wide homes on them that
Okay.
they're having built, like factory homes at the school.
Yeah, I thought you were talking about a recent one that.
No,
It's
no,
kinda going
it's
through the
for the
process
smaller,
already.
single wide type lots. And that's how the Old Town Berthoud was kind of actually developed. They were all 25-foot wide lots, and then you come in and buy 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 and then build your house on it. So
I like that idea, if we go back to water, of using that to help out affordability. Hope I didn't come off as rude.
No, not at all, but just as a,
Because I've heard that argument before too, of other things, of, hey,
You
this
know,
is
I was
gonna cost too much. I
hearing-
think the developer's just gonna go maximum the market can bear, no matter what.
That's
That's
the
just
key-
my thought.
That's the key part to it, what the market can bear,
Yeah.
and you guys are saying.
You're gonna sell,
the same
yeah.
thing.
you're
Yeah,
gonna sell
and at
maximum
some
market
point,
value.
the cost to develop that house might create a situation where the margin's no longer enough for a builder to do that work. But yeah, they're gonna pass on 100% of the cost they can, up to the point the market will bear.
cost of the market, yeah.
I fully agree with your comment, and that's why I'm really sensitive when we talk about raising fees for developers or impact fees, is I've watched the introduction of impact fees in Berthoud and at the fire district and other places, and watched how it creates revenue streams, but it's also creating a market that's higher value, higher priced. Really, it's becoming we are almost creating an issue that now we're trying to solve, because we want affordable living, but the living is going up partly because of the fees we're putting on developers. That's just my opinion.
Yeah. I think we go back and forth on that.
Yeah, just.
We may need a
side-
whole nother study
side-
session.
Maybe we need another
side
study on that.
tangent,
That's a study
But
session.
I
It's on
agree.
affordable housing.
We won't solve that problem tonight, affordable housing, we won't solve it.
But you brought it up plenty of times. I think we should have another discussion on affordable housing. I think we need to require it, because I don't think,
Next study session.
the developer will do it.
Thanks for the invite and from
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
commission, and anytime you guys wanna invite us to a study session, we'd be more than willing to
Yeah,
come.
I learned a
Yes,
lot, so thank you.
Schools, affordable housing, transportation, water, I think.
Oh, Metro District's coming up too, don't you worry.
Yeah, Metro
Oh,
districts,
good.
yeah.
I'd love to be
That'd be a
back.
good meeting for
It's a 2 drink minimum for that
It's a
meeting.
2-drink.
All right, let me go ahead and adjourn. Have a great night, everybody.
Thanks, guys. Great job.
Two drinking.
What time did you get to tonight? Oh, we didn't even get past 10.
It feels super hot here to me, am I the
I
only
know,
one?
I'm glad you went over and
Oh,
turned
okay.
it down.
I thought I did, but it didn't seem to make any difference.
I'm wilting.
It never got any. Totally, well, and I have not felt well for the last 2 days, and I thought, I better not be sitting here like.
You're in Mr. Rona.
Yeah,
You're in the right area for the job.
yeah, definitely.
Maybe I turned up the wrong, maybe I changed the wrong one, and that one didn't seem to do anything.
it's warm.
Yeah.
No.
Oh, jeez.
There used to be like some varying levels of discomfort.